I used to love sharing my life on Facebook. Living in Chicago, there's always something to do or see, and I enjoy documenting it all. My posts were mostly about my work as a graphic designer, the coffee shops I frequented in Wicker Park, and the occasional weekend getaway to nearby cities like Milwaukee or Indianapolis. My profile was public because I never thought I had anything to hide. I wasn't famous, just another person sharing bits of my life online. I figured it was harmless. One day, I noticed a new friend request from a guy named Adam. I didn't recognize him, but we had a few mutual friends, so I accepted the request without much thought. His profile looked normal enough. He seemed to be around my age, maybe a few years older, with photos of him at various Chicago landmarks, a few selfies, and posts about sports and movies. His posts were nothing out of the ordinary, so I didn't think twice about it. Adam started liking a lot of my posts, especially the ones where I checked in at places around the city. At first, I was flattered. It seemed like I had a new follower who enjoyed my content. He even commented on a few photos, asking where the best spots for coffee were in Chicago or complimenting my design work. It felt nice to have someone who shared similar interests, especially in a big city where it's easy to feel anonymous. But then, things started to get weird. Adam began commenting on nearly every post, not just the ones about Chicago or graphic design. He commented on photos of my friends, asking about them or making vague comments like, "Looks like a fun group." He seemed to know details about my life that I didn't remember sharing. For example, I once posted about a specific type of coffee I loved, and Adam commented that he had seen me drinking it at a cafe in Logan Square the week before. I hadn't mentioned being there online, but I shrugged it off, assuming he might have seen me in passing. As time went on, his messages became more personal. He would send me private messages, asking about my day or making small talk. It was mostly harmless, but something about it made me uncomfortable. I wasn't used to someone I barely knew taking such an interest in my life. I stopped replying to his messages as often, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, he became more persistent. His messages started to arrive at all hours of the day and night. He'd ask why I hadn't responded or if everything was okay. I didn't know how to respond, so I ignored him. One day, after not hearing from Adam for a few days, I posted about a new design project I was excited about. A few hours later, I received a message from Adam congratulating me on the project. He mentioned details that I hadn't shared publicly, specifics about the client and the scope of the work. I was stunned. I had no idea how he could have known this. I hadn't told anyone outside of work, and I certainly hadn't posted about it. My stomach dropped, and I started to feel uneasy. I decided to block him, hoping that would be the end of it. For a while it was. I didn't hear from Adam, and I started to relax. I figured he must have been just another online weirdo, and that by blocking him, I'd solve the problem. Life went back to normal, or so I thought. Then one evening after work, I headed to one of my favorite coffee shops in Wicker Park. It was a cozy spot with big windows, perfect for people watching and getting some work done. I hadn't posted about going there, but as I sat down with my laptop, I felt a strange sense of unease. I glanced around the cafe and saw someone familiar sitting a few tables away, partially obscured by a large potted plant. It was Adam. He was staring right at me, not even trying to hide it. My heart started pounding, and I quickly packed up my things to leave. As I walked out, I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. After that incident, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I started looking over my shoulder more often and checking the faces of people around me. Adam didn't message me again, but I kept seeing him. He would be across the street from my apartment building or a few tables away at a restaurant where I was having dinner with friends. He never approached me, but he was always there, watching. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that Chicago was a big city, and it wasn't unusual to run into the same person more than once. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. The final straw came one night when I was out with some friends in the Loop. We were celebrating a birthday at a bar I'd never been to before. I hadn't posted anything about the night, wanting to keep it a private event. But as I was laughing and chatting with my friends, I felt that now familiar chill run down my spine. I turned around and saw Adam standing at the bar, holding a drink and staring directly at me. He didn't smile or wave, just stood there watching. It was like he knew I would be there. I left the bar immediately, making up an excuse about feeling sick. I rushed outside and got into the first cab I could find. As we drove away, I glanced back and saw Adam step out of the bar, watching as the cab pulled away. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I went to a friend's place, too scared to be alone. The next morning, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was a plain piece of paper with a single sentence written on it. "I'm always watching." There was no signature, but I knew who it was from. My hands were shaking as I read the note, and I felt a wave of nausea. How had he found my car? I hadn't posted anything about my address or where I parked. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That a guy who I had accepted a friend request from on Facebook was following me around. It sounded paranoid, like something out of a movie. But this was real, and I didn't know what to do. I started changing my routines. I stopped going to my favorite spots, avoiding the places I used to frequent. I even started taking different routes to work, hoping to throw him off. I locked down all my social media profiles, making everything private and deleting any posts that might give away my location. I told my friends and family what was happening, and they were supportive, but there was only so much they could do. I couldn't shake the feeling that Adam was still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't see him for a while after that. Maybe he had lost interest, or maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. Either way, the fear didn't go away. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound or movement. I installed extra locks on my doors and started carrying pepper spray in my bag. I even considered moving to a different city, but I loved Chicago too much to leave. It felt like I was being driven out of my own life, forced to live in fear because of someone I had never even met in person. Then one day I received a friend request from a new account. The profile picture was of a sunset, something generic and unassuming. The name wasn't Adam, but it didn't matter. I knew it was him. The request was a reminder that he was still there, lurking in the background of my life. I deleted the request and blocked the account. But the damage was done. The fear was back, stronger than ever. I started seeing him again, always at a distance. Never close enough to confront, but always close enough to be seen. He was at the grocery store across the street from my gym, sitting on a bench near my apartment building. He was like a ghost, always just out of reach, but never far away. I stopped going out as much, retreating into the safety of my apartment. Even there, I didn't feel completely safe. I kept the blinds closed and double-checked the locks every night. The thought of him being outside watching made my skin crawl. I considered getting a restraining order, but without knowing his real name or having any concrete evidence, it felt like a lost cause. I hadn't taken any photos of him or kept the note he left on my car. I didn't want to keep those reminders of the nightmare I was living. The police had already told me there wasn't much they could do without more information, so I felt trapped, powerless to stop him. I tried to carry on with my life, but it was impossible. Every time I left the house, I was on high alert, scanning the faces of everyone around me. I couldn't enjoy the things I used to love, like going to coffee shops or exploring the city. Every place felt tainted by the possibility of running into Adam. My friends noticed the change in me, but I didn't want to burden them with my fears. I started distancing myself. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I knew I had locked it before leaving that morning. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't leave without knowing what was inside. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, my hand gripping the pepper spray in my bag. The apartment was dark and quiet, just as I had left it. But something felt off. I walked through the rooms, checking for any signs of an intruder. Everything was in its place. Nothing seemed disturbed. But when I reached my bedroom, I froze. On my bed, laid out neatly, was a single red rose. My blood ran cold. There was no note, no sign of forced entry, nothing to indicate how it had gotten there, but I knew it was a message. He had been in my apartment, in my space, and there was nothing I could do about it. I called the police and they came to check the place out, but without any evidence of a break-in, there was nothing they could do. They suggested I install a security system, which I did the very next day, but the damage was already done. My home, the one place where I should have felt safe, had been violated. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and left, staying with friends and family for the next few weeks while I figured out what to do. I eventually found a new apartment in a different neighborhood, far from where I had been living. I didn't tell anyone the exact location, not even my closest friends. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and started fresh. It's been months now, and I haven't seen Adam since I moved. I am a 34-year-old guy living in Seattle. I work as a software developer, so I'm pretty tech-savvy, or at least I thought I was. My life is pretty average, work, home, or hanging out with friends. I'm not one to post a lot on social media, but I do like to keep my Facebook account updated with pictures of hiking trips, family gatherings, and the occasional check-in at a new restaurant or bar around town. I never really worried about privacy too much. My profile was set to friends only, and I thought that was enough. One day I tried logging into my Facebook account from my phone, and I got a weird error message saying my password was incorrect. At first I thought I must have typed it wrong, so I tried again. Same thing. I tried one more time, just to be sure, but it still didn't work. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I knew I hadn't changed my password, so I decided to reset it. I went through the usual steps, got the email from Facebook, and created a new password. I figured that would be the end of it, but when I logged in, something felt off. Nothing was obviously wrong. My profile picture was the same, my posts were still there, and all my friends were still listed. But I had this nagging feeling that something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it, so I just shrugged it off and went about my day. A couple of hours later, I started getting messages from friends asking about some weird things I'd supposedly posted. One friend asked why I was asking about his address. Another wondered why I needed his phone number again. That's when the alarm bells started ringing. I immediately checked my recent activity, and there it was. A bunch of messages sent from my account that I had definitely not sent. Whoever had access to my account was messaging my friends, pretending to be me and asking for personal information. My heart started racing. I quickly posted a status update warning everyone not to respond to any messages from me and to ignore any strange requests. Then I went back and started deleting the messages, hoping I could stop whoever was behind this. Over the next few days, I became paranoid. I changed my password again, enabled two-factor authentication, and made sure all my security settings were tightened up. I thought that would be enough. But strange things kept happening. I'd log in to find that someone had liked posts on my behalf, or left comments that I didn't remember writing. I even found some of my older posts edited with bizarre and random content. It was like someone was playing a game with me, messing with my account just enough to make me feel unsettled, but not enough to do any real damage. At first, I thought maybe I was hacked by some random person who was just having fun at my expense, but the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. This person wasn't trying to scam my friends out of money or steal my identity. They were just there, watching, waiting, manipulating my account in small, almost unnoticeable ways. It was like they were trying to make me doubt my own memory, my own sanity. I became obsessed with trying to figure out who was behind it. I went through my friends list trying to see if there was anyone who might have had a reason to do this, but nothing stood out. I checked my email, my other social media accounts, my bank accounts. Everything was fine. No one had hacked into anything else. It was just my Facebook account that was being targeted. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard my phone buzz with a notification, only to find nothing there. I'd log into Facebook multiple times a day, checking for any new activity, any sign that the hacker was still there. It got to the point where I could hardly focus at work. I was constantly distracted, constantly on edge. One day, I was sitting in my office when I got a message from a coworker. He asked why I'd sent him a message asking for his home address. I hadn't, of course, but when I checked my sent messages, there it was. Another message I didn't remember sending. This one was different, though. It wasn't just a random question. It was specific. Like the person behind it knew exactly what to say to make it seem like it was really me. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some random hacker. This was someone who knew me. Someone who was close enough to understand how I communicated, how I interacted with people. The thought made my blood run cold. I started going through my friends list again, looking at each profile more carefully this time. I scrutinized every detail, trying to find anything that seemed out of place. But there was nothing. Every friend, every contact seemed legitimate. No one stood out as a potential threat. I started questioning everything. Who had I talked to recently? Who had I upset? Had I been too open with someone? I couldn't think of anyone who would have a reason to do this. It didn't make any sense. Then things escalated. One day, I came home from work to find a package waiting for me. I hadn't ordered anything, so I was confused. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a single USB drive with no note or explanation. My first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. I plugged it into an old laptop, not wanting to risk anything on my main computer. There was only one file on the drive, a video. I didn't want to watch it, but I knew I had to. The video started, and it was just me. Footage of me sitting at my desk at work, typing away on my computer. Then the scene changed, showing me walking into my apartment, going through my nightly routine. The video ended with a close-up shot of my front door, the camera lingering there as if to say, "I know where you live." I felt sick. Whoever was behind this wasn't just messing with my Facebook account. They were watching me. They knew where I worked, where I lived, and they were sending a message. I decided to take a break from Facebook, hoping that if I stopped using it, the hacker would lose interest. I deactivated my account, cut off all social media, and tried to go about my life as normally as possible. But the damage was already done. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. I started taking different routes to work, avoiding my usual haunts, anything to throw off whoever was watching me. One night, after weeks of living in this state of constant anxiety, I decided I couldn't take it anymore, and I deleted the account for good. I moved to a new apartment, got a new phone number, and changed my routines again. Last year, my friend Julie was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. It was the kind of news that hits you like a freight train. Julie and I had been close since college, and seeing her go through something so devastating was unbearable. I felt helpless, but I wanted to do something, anything, to help her and her family. They were already struggling with the medical bills, and I figured that starting a fundraiser could at least ease some of that burden. I've always been pretty active on social media, especially Facebook, so I decided to set up the fundraiser there. I created a page explaining Julie's situation, included some photos of us from better times, and set a goal of raising $20,000. I shared it with all our mutual friends, family, and even the local community groups I was part of. The response was overwhelming. Within a few days, we had already raised a few $1,000s, and it felt like we might actually reach our goal. As the donations kept coming in, I was in constant contact with Julie's family, making sure the money was going directly to her medical bills. It felt good to be doing something productive, something that made a real difference. People were incredibly generous, and I was touched by the outpouring of support. About a week into the fundraiser, I noticed something strange. One of Julie's co-workers messaged me, asking why there were two fundraisers for Julie. At first, I thought she was mistaken, but when I checked, I found another fundraiser with the exact same title, description, and photos. The only difference was that the money was going to a different account. I felt my stomach drop. I immediately contacted the co-worker to find out more, and she told me she had donated to the other fundraiser, thinking it was the same one I had started. Panic set in as I realized what was happening. Someone had duplicated my fundraiser to scam people out of their money. I was furious and sickened at the thought that someone would take advantage of Julie's situation like this. I quickly reported the fake fundraiser to Facebook, but it was still up for hours afterward. In the meantime, I tried to warn as many people as possible, posting updates on the real fundraiser's page and messaging donors directly. It felt like I was in a nightmare. More and more people messaged me, confused about which fundraiser was legitimate. Some had already donated to the fake one and were asking how they could get their money back. I didn't know what to tell them. I was already dealing with the stress of helping Julie and her family, and now this added layer of betrayal was overwhelming. I couldn't believe that someone would sink so low. By the time Facebook finally took down the fake fundraiser, the damage was done. Thousands of dollars had been diverted to the scammer's account, and those who had donated were understandably angry and upset. I tried to explain the situation to them, but it didn't make it any easier. I felt responsible, even though I knew it wasn't my fault. I had started this fundraiser to help Julie, and now it was causing even more stress and confusion for everyone involved. I reached out to Facebook, asking if they could track down the person responsible, but all I got was a generic response about how they were investigating. I didn't hold out much hope that they'd find the scammer. In the meantime, I had to deal with the fallout, people asking for their money back, others who were hesitant to donate now that they knew there had been a scam, and the guilt that gnawed at me every day. Julie was too sick to know the details of what had happened, and I didn't want to burden her with it. But her family knew, and they were just as angry and upset as I was. The fundraiser had been a beacon of hope for them, a way to see that people cared and wanted to help. Now it felt tainted. Even as the real fundraiser continued to receive donations, it was hard to shake the shadow of what had happened. I started getting messages from people I didn't even know, accusing me of being part of the scam. They couldn't believe that someone would do something like this unless the original organizer was involved. It was devastating. I was just trying to help my friend, and now my reputation was being dragged through the mud. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The stress was overwhelming. I thought about shutting down the fundraiser altogether, but I knew that Julie still needed the money. So I kept it going, trying to focus on the positive, on the people who were still donating and supporting us. But every time I logged into Facebook, I was reminded of what had happened. I started to hate the platform, hate the way it made it so easy for someone to steal from others, to take advantage of a situation like this. Eventually, the fundraiser reached its goal, and I was able to transfer the money to Julie's family. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt hollow, tainted by what had happened. I kept thinking about all the people who had been scammed, who had given their hard-earned money to help someone in need, only to have it stolen. I wished there was more I could do for them, but I was at a loss. To this day, I don't know who was behind the fake fundraiser. I never heard back from Facebook about their investigation, and I doubt I ever will. I'm a musician based in Austin, Texas. My band isn't exactly famous, but we've got a decent following around the city. We play at local bars, small venues, and occasionally get gigs at festivals or private events. It's mostly for fun, but we take it seriously enough to try and build a real presence, especially on social media. Facebook has been a big part of that. We use it to promote our shows, share new music, and connect with fans. We're not huge, but we've got a solid group of followers who support us, which is all you can really ask for in a scene as competitive as Austin's. A few months ago, we booked a show at a bar downtown. It wasn't anything major, just a regular weekend gig, but we were excited about it. We'd been working on some new songs, and this was going to be the first time we played them live. I created a Facebook event for it, as usual, and started promoting it. I invited all our followers, shared it in local music groups, and even threw a few bucks at Facebook ads to get the word out. The response was great. Lots of people were interested, and it looked like we'd have a good crowd. As the event date got closer, I noticed something unusual. The number of people RSVPing to the event kept going up, way higher than what we'd typically expect. At first, I was thrilled. More people coming out to see us? Awesome. But then it started to get weird. The event was getting shared by people and groups I'd never heard of, some of which had nothing to do with music or Austin. They were private groups with cryptic names and little to no public information. The members looked like they were from all over, not just locals who'd randomly decided to come to our show. I started getting messages from people asking strange questions about the event, what time the doors opened, how many people the venue could hold, if there'd be security. Some of these messages were polite, others were a bit more aggressive, like they were expecting something specific from the night that I couldn't quite figure out. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just a fluke or that our event had gotten picked up by some bot accounts or something, but it kept getting stranger. A few days before the show, I got a message from a guy named Carl. He told me he was excited for the event and asked if there was going to be a cover charge. When I told him there was a small fee at the door, he seemed annoyed, but still said he'd be there. I didn't think much of it until I checked out his profile. It was bare. No pictures, no posts, just a handful of friends, most of whom looked just as sketchy. Then I started noticing more profiles like his RSVP'd to the event. It was like a wave of fake accounts had suddenly taken an interest in our little gig. The day of the show, I was nervous. The Facebook event showed over 1,000 people interested, which was way more than the venue could handle. The bar could maybe hold 150 at most, and I started worrying about overcrowding. I called the venue, and they assured me they'd handle it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When we arrived at the bar that evening to set up, things seemed normal enough. The usual crowd was there, a mix of regulars and a few new faces. But as the night went on, more and more people started showing up, and not the type of crowd we were used to. There were groups of people who didn't seem like they were there for the music at all. They were hanging around outside, looking shady, and some of them were trying to talk their way in without paying the cover. The bouncers were having a hard time keeping them out, and there was a tense atmosphere building. We went on stage around 10 p.m., and by that time the bar was packed. It should have been a good thing, but the vibe was off. The usual excitement wasn't there. People weren't as engaged with the music, and there were more and more of these unfamiliar faces, just standing around, not really paying attention to the band. It felt like they were waiting for something, and I couldn't shake the growing unease. Halfway through our set, things started to unravel. A fight broke out near the back of the bar. At first, it seemed like just a couple of drunk guys getting into it, but then it spread. More people got involved, and it turned into a full-blown brawl. The bouncers and staff tried to break it up, but it was chaos. Glasses were smashing, people were shouting, and there was this surge of panic as more fights started breaking out across the room. We stopped playing and tried to figure out what the hell was going on. The crowd was pushing and shoving, and it looked like some people were deliberately stirring things up, almost like they were there just to cause trouble. The bar staff was overwhelmed, and the whole place was on the verge of a riot. It was terrifying. We grabbed our gear and tried to get off the stage, but the crowd was surging, and it was hard to move. Finally, the police showed up. They pushed their way through the crowd, trying to break things up, but it wasn't easy. The whole scene had turned into something out of control. People were getting dragged out, arrested, and the bar was trashed. I couldn't believe what was happening. This was supposed to be just another gig, but it had turned into something ugly and dangerous. After the police cleared the place out, we were left standing in the wreckage of what had been a normal bar just a couple of hours earlier. The owner was furious, not at us, but at the situation. He said he'd never seen anything like it, and he didn't know why it had happened. I tried to explain about the weird activity on the Facebook event, but it didn't make any sense. None of it made sense. For days afterward, I kept getting messages from people who'd been at the show, some apologizing, others just asking what the hell had happened. But the weirdest ones were from accounts I didn't recognize, saying things like, "That was fun," or "When's the next one?" I blocked them, reported them, did everything I could to distance myself from whatever that was, but it left me shaken. I'm a high school senior in Philadelphia, and like most teenagers, I spend a lot of time online. Between schoolwork, chatting with friends, and browsing social media, it's a big part of my life. I'm not the type to get into online arguments, but a few months ago, I found myself in the middle of a heated discussion in a Facebook group about a controversial topic. I don't even remember how it started. I think I commented on someone's post about something political. It wasn't anything major, just my opinion, but things escalated quickly. People started replying to my comments, some agreeing, but most arguing against me. It got intense fast. I tried to explain my point, but the replies kept coming. And they weren't just disagreeing, they were getting personal. They called me names, insulted my intelligence, and made it clear they thought I was an idiot. I should have just walked away, but I felt like I had to defend myself. That was a mistake. The argument spilled over into private messages. I started getting messages from people I didn't know, and they were even nastier than the public comments. They told me I was worthless, that I should stay out of discussions I didn't understand, and some of them even made threats. It was scary, but I thought it was just internet trolls being trolls. I blocked them and tried to forget about it. A few days later, things got worse. I came home from school to find an envelope on our front porch. There was no return address, just my name, handwritten on the front. I opened it and found a printout of one of the Facebook conversations I'd had, with a note written in red ink. "We know where you live." My heart dropped. Someone had taken the argument from online and brought it into my real life. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. I didn't tell my parents right away. I didn't want to worry them, and I figured it was just some sick joke. But the next day, I started getting more messages. They weren't just from random accounts this time. They had personal information about me. They knew my address, my phone number, even what school I went to. One message mentioned my little sister by name. That's when I realized this wasn't just trolling. This was something else, something serious. I deleted my Facebook account, hoping that would make it stop. It didn't. The messages kept coming, this time through my phone. Texts from unknown numbers, threatening me, telling me to watch my back. I blocked the numbers, but new ones kept popping up. It felt like I was being hunted, like there was no escape. I started skipping school, too scared to leave the house. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race. One afternoon, I was walking home from a friend's house when I noticed a car driving slowly behind me. At first, I thought it was just someone looking for parking, but as I kept walking, the car kept following. My stomach twisted in fear. I turned down a side street, trying to lose them, but they followed. I didn't want to lead them to my house, so I ducked into a convenience store, hoping they would drive past. I watched from inside as the car stopped in front of the store. They didn't get out, just sat there, waiting. I called my dad, trying to keep my voice steady, and told him I needed a ride home. He came and picked me up, and by the time we left, the car was gone. I told him what had happened, and he was furious. He called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They told us to keep an eye out and report any more incidents, but I could tell they didn't really take it seriously. It was just online harassment to them, nothing they could act on. I felt completely helpless. I didn't know who was doing this or why they were targeting me. The fear was constant. I stopped leaving the house unless I absolutely had to, and when I did, I was always looking over my shoulder. I kept my phone on silent, too scared to check the messages that kept coming in. My grades started slipping, and I lost touch with most of my friends. I didn't want to drag them into this mess, so I just isolated myself. Then, one night, I was woken up by a loud bang outside my window. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and looked outside. Someone had thrown a brick through our living room window. My parents were already up, freaking out. We called the police again, and they came to check it out, but they didn't find anything. No note, no sign of who had done it. Just another reminder that whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. After that, my parents insisted on getting security cameras installed around the house. It made me feel a little safer, but not much. I knew the cameras wouldn't stop whoever was doing this. They were too determined. The messages continued, but now they were more sinister, more personal. They knew things about my family, our routines, where we shopped, where my sister went to dance class. It was like they were always watching, always one step ahead. One day I got a text that shook me to my core. It was a picture of me taken from a distance as I was leaving school. The message said, "Nice outfit today." I felt sick. They were close, closer than I'd ever imagined. I went home and broke down, finally telling my parents everything. I couldn't hide it anymore. They were horrified and immediately took me to the police station. The police took it seriously. They looked at the messages, the pictures, the brick through the window. They started an investigation, but they told us it would take time. In the meantime, they advised us to be cautious, to change our routines, and to keep a low profile. My parents considered moving, but that wasn't a quick fix. We were stuck, waiting for the police to find whoever was behind this. The next few weeks were hell. I was afraid to leave the house, afraid to check my phone, afraid of everything. My parents were on edge too, constantly checking the security cameras. The worst part was not knowing who was doing this or why. It could have been anyone, someone from school, a neighbor, or just some random psycho who'd fixated on me. The uncertainty was maddening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the harassment stopped. The messages stopped coming. The strange car didn't show up again, and the police didn't find any more leads. It was like whoever was behind it had just disappeared. I finished high school online, too scared to go back in person. My parents eventually did decide to move, hoping a fresh start would help us all heal. A few years ago, I went through a really rough breakup. We had been together for almost 3 years, and it ended badly. There was a lot of anger and resentment on both sides, but I thought we'd both just move on and live our lives. I couldn't have been more wrong. At first, everything seemed normal. We did the typical thing after a breakup, blocked each other on social media, deleted each other's numbers, and tried to forget. I focused on my job in San Francisco, spent time with friends, and eventually started dating again. But a few weeks after the breakup, I noticed something odd. Some of my friends started acting distant, even cold, and I didn't understand why. One night, a close friend texted me out of the blue, asking why I had said such horrible things about them. I had no idea what they were talking about. When I asked for more details, they sent me a screenshot of a Facebook page. It was a private group, but the page was filled with screenshots of old text conversations, private messages, and photos of me. Some I recognized, others I didn't. The posts were all about me, twisting my words, making it look like I had been saying terrible things about my friends, co-workers, and even my family. I was horrified. I tried to join the group to see more, but it was private, and they didn't accept my request. My friend let me look through some of the posts, and the more I saw, the sicker I felt. It was clear that whoever was behind this knew me well. They had access to private conversations, photos that had never been posted online, and they were using all of it to smear my reputation. I immediately thought of my ex. We had exchanged a lot of personal stuff during our relationship, texts, photos, you name it, but I couldn't believe they would go this far. I reached out to a few other friends who were still talking to me, and they told me they had also seen the page and were shocked by what was being posted. Some had believed the lies at first, but after talking to me, they realized something wasn't right. I decided to confront my ex directly. I found their new number and called, but they denied everything. They said they didn't know what I was talking about and told me to leave them alone. I didn't believe them, but without proof, there wasn't much I could do. I felt powerless. The page kept growing, more people joined, and more lies were spread. My social circle was shrinking, and I could feel people pulling away from me. The worst part was how detailed and believable the posts were. They used just enough truth to make the lies seem credible. Old arguments we had were taken out of context. Private jokes were twisted into something sinister, and they even posted fake screenshots of conversations I had never had. Whoever was behind this was going out of their way to ruin my life. One day I got a call from my boss. They had been contacted by someone claiming to have dirt on me, and they had sent my boss a link to the Facebook page. I was called into HR, where I had to explain that it was all a lie. Thankfully, they believed me, but the damage was done. My reputation at work was tarnished, and I knew people were talking behind my back. I became paranoid, wondering who else had seen the page and what they thought of me. I tried reporting the group to Facebook, but nothing happened. The group was private, and since I wasn't a member, I couldn't see most of the posts. The few screenshots I had weren't enough for Facebook to take it seriously. It felt like I was screaming into the void, begging for help, but no one was listening. I started to withdraw from social media entirely. I deleted my accounts, changed my phone number, and tried to lay low, hoping it would all blow over. But it didn't stop. The page kept going. And now, they were posting lies about my family, too. My sister called me one night in tears, asking why people were saying such horrible things about her. It broke my heart to know she was being dragged into this mess because of me. The harassment wasn't just online. I started getting strange packages in the mail, random things like a bag of rotten fruit, dead flowers, and once an envelope filled with shredded photos of me. There was never a return address, and I had no idea who was sending them. It was like whoever was behind this wanted to invade every part of my life, not just online, but in the real world too. I was at my breaking point. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I didn't know who to trust or where to turn. One night, I got an email from a friend who had managed to join the Facebook group under a fake account. They sent me screenshots of the latest posts, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. They had posted my home address, along with a message that said something like, "Let's pay her a visit." It was a clear threat, and I knew I couldn't stay at my apartment any longer. I packed a bag and went to stay with my parents, too scared to be alone. I went to the police with the evidence. They took my statement and said they would look into it, but I could tell they didn't think much would come of it. It felt like I was fighting a ghost, someone who could ruin my life without ever showing their face. I stayed with my parents for a while, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every little noise. The fear was suffocating. After a few weeks, the Facebook group was suddenly deleted. I don't know if the police had something to do with it or if the person behind it decided to move on, but the damage was done. My relationships with friends and coworkers were strained, some beyond repair. My sense of safety was shattered, and I was left with this gnawing fear that it could all start again at any moment. I live in Portland, Oregon, and like most people, I spend a lot of time on my phone. It's practically an extension of me at this point. Work emails, social media, messaging, everything runs through that little device. I'm not particularly tech savvy, but I know my way around the basics, and I've never had any major issues. That changed one day in a way I still can't fully wrap my head around. It started like any other Saturday. I had a lazy morning, made some coffee, and lounged around the apartment. I had plans later in the day, but I wasn't in a rush to do anything. I picked up my phone and started scrolling through Facebook, liking a few posts, commenting on a friend's photo, the usual stuff. After a while, I got up to get ready and tossed my phone on the bed, not really paying attention to where it landed. As I was brushing my teeth, I noticed the faint sound of voices coming from the bedroom. At first, I thought it was the neighbors or maybe someone outside, but the sound was too clear. I went back to my room and found my phone lying face down on the bed. The screen was lit up, and when I picked it up, I realized it was recording a video. Somehow, I had started a Facebook live stream without realizing it. I froze for a second, staring at the screen in confusion. I hadn't meant to go live. How the hell had that even happened? I quickly ended the stream, feeling a rush of embarrassment. How long had it been running? Who had seen it? I didn't even know what had been captured on the video. I went into my Facebook account and found the stream. It had only been live for a few minutes, but that was enough to make me feel uneasy. The video started with a close-up of the bedspread, then shifted around as the phone got bumped when I threw it. For a while, it just showed the ceiling and the edge of my dresser. The audio picked up the mundane sounds of me brushing my teeth, humming to myself. Nothing too embarrassing, but still, the thought that people had seen this made my skin crawl. I checked the viewer list and saw that a few of my friends had watched it, along with a couple of random names I didn't recognize. I felt a little sick. I mean, it wasn't like anything bad had happened, but the whole situation felt invasive, like a violation of privacy. I quickly deleted the video and messaged the friends who had watched it, trying to laugh it off as a stupid mistake. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept thinking about how easily that could have gone differently. What if I had been changing? What if the camera had caught something really personal? I felt stupid for being so paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I started double-checking my phone, making sure nothing else was running that shouldn't be. Later that night, I went out with some friends to a bar downtown. I tried to forget about the weirdness from earlier, and for a while, it worked. We had a few drinks, laughed, talked about work and life, the usual stuff. By the time I got home, I was feeling better, like maybe I had just overreacted. When I got back to my apartment, I plugged in my phone to charge and went to take a shower. After I finished, I checked my phone and my heart nearly stopped. There was a notification from Facebook. Your video has ended. View your live stream. I opened the app, my hands shaking. And sure enough, there was another live stream. This one much longer than the first. It had been running for nearly an hour, capturing everything from when I got home to when I was in the shower. The video started with me walking into my apartment, dropping my keys on the counter and kicking off my shoes. It followed me as I moved around the living room, talking to myself, laughing at something on TV. Then it showed me going into the bathroom, closing the door, and the sound of the shower running. The camera didn't capture anything inside the bathroom, but just knowing that this was out there made me feel sick. I didn't understand how this was happening. I hadn't started the stream. I hadn't even touched my phone since I plugged it in. I quickly deleted the video, but not before seeing that it had been viewed by more people this time, some of whom I didn't even know. My mind raced with possibilities. Was my phone hacked? Was someone messing with me? I couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation, and that scared me even more. I spent the rest of the night trying to figure out what was going on. I checked my phone settings, changed my passwords, and even considered uninstalling Facebook altogether. But nothing seemed out of place. Everything looked normal, yet I knew something was very wrong. The next day, I was a wreck. I barely slept, too paranoid to let my guard down. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, terrified that it would start recording again without my knowledge. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I couldn't trust the one thing I always relied on. I started thinking about all the other times I might not have noticed. Had this happened before? Had people been watching me for who knows how long? I decided to take my phone to a repair shop, hoping they could find something, anything that would explain what was happening. The guy at the shop ran some diagnostics, but everything came back clean. No viruses, no malware, nothing. He looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to explain what had been happening. I left the shop feeling even more helpless. For a few days, nothing happened. I tried to get back to normal, but I was always on edge, always waiting for the next thing to go wrong. I avoided using my phone as much as possible, only checking it for work emails and the bare essentials. I didn't touch Facebook. Then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a noise. It was faint, just a soft click, but in the silence of my apartment, it was unmistakable. I reached for my phone, which was on the nightstand, and saw that the screen was lit up. A notification from Facebook popped up. You are now live. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the phone and saw that it was streaming again, showing a live feed of me lying in bed, staring at the screen in terror. I ended the stream immediately, deleted Facebook, and threw the phone across the room. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the camera turning on again, broadcasting my every move to whoever was watching. I felt trapped, paranoid, like there was no escape from this invisible threat. The next morning, I took the phone back to the repair shop and demanded that they wipe it clean. I couldn't trust it anymore. The guy did what I asked, and I left the shop with my phone feeling like a stranger in my own hands. I reinstalled the basics, email, contacts, nothing more. I couldn't bring myself to reinstall Facebook. I remember the day it started clearly. It was a Saturday morning and I had a bunch of errands to run. I went to the grocery store, picked up some dry cleaning, and stopped by the pet store to get food for my dog, Daisy. It was a pretty typical weekend routine, and by early afternoon I was back home, ready to relax. I decided to take Daisy for a walk in the park near my apartment, something we did almost every day. The park wasn't crowded, just a few other people out with their dogs, some kids playing, and a couple of joggers. Daisy was her usual happy self, sniffing everything and wagging her tail at everyone we passed. We took our usual route, a loop around the park that took about 20 minutes. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, but as we were heading back to my apartment, I noticed something strange. I got a message on Facebook from an account I didn't recognize. The profile had no picture, just a generic gray silhouette, and the name was something random like John Smith. But I knew I didn't know this person. The message said, "Nice day for a walk, isn't it?" My first thought was that it was some kind of spam, so I ignored it and didn't think much of it. The next day I got another message from the same account. This time it said, "You and Daisy make a cute pair." That stopped me in my tracks. How did this person know my dog's name? I felt a weird mix of confusion and unease. I didn't respond, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was someone I knew playing a joke, but the whole thing felt off. I went through my Facebook friends list, trying to figure out if someone had set up a fake account just to mess with me, but nothing seemed out of place. I considered asking my friends if they were behind it, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I decided to just block the account and move on. A few days passed, and I tried to forget about it. Then, one evening, I was sitting on my couch watching TV when I got a notification on my phone. Another message, this time from a different account. The message said, "I liked the blue shirt you wore today." My blood ran cold. I had worn a blue shirt that day, but I hadn't posted anything about it online. There was no way this person could have known what I was wearing unless they had seen me. I started to panic. I looked around my apartment, half expecting to see someone watching me, but of course there was no one there. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked and tried to calm down. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe they had seen me in passing and recognized me from my profile picture, but that explanation didn't make me feel any better. The next morning, I found a small envelope on my doorstep. There was no address, just my name written on the front in neat handwriting. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and took it inside. I opened it to find a single piece of paper with a photograph attached. The photo was of me, taken from a distance, while I was walking Daisy in the park. The note below the photo said, "I'm closer than you think." I felt sick. My first instinct was to call the police, but what could I tell them? That someone had sent me a creepy photo? That I was getting weird messages on Facebook? It felt like something out of a movie, not real life, but the fear was real. I didn't know what to do. I started changing my routines. I stopped going to the park, started driving to different neighborhoods to walk Daisy, and avoided being out at the same time every day. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. Every time I got another message, I felt my heart race. They were never threatening, not directly, but they were always personal, always about something I had done that day. "Nice run this morning. Coffee at your favorite cafe again?" It was like this person was watching my every move. I stopped using Facebook entirely, hoping that if I cut off that connection, the messages would stop. But they didn't. They kept coming, now as text messages from an unknown number. I tried blocking the number, but new ones would pop up. Whoever this was, they were relentless. One night, I was coming home from work later than usual. The parking lot at my apartment complex was mostly empty, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. As I got out of my car, I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you know you're being watched. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I walked into my bedroom, I noticed something out of place. My window, which I always kept closed and locked, was slightly open. I walked over to it, my heart pounding, and saw that the lock had been tampered with. It wasn't broken, but it was clear that someone had tried to force it open. I felt a wave of panic. Someone had been here, in my apartment while I was at work. I called the police, finally too scared to handle it on my own. They came and took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry other than the window lock. They suggested I install security cameras and change my locks, which I did the very next day, but the damage was done. I no longer felt safe in my own home. The messages stopped for a while after that, and I thought maybe whoever it was had finally given up. But then, one morning, I found another envelope on my doorstep. This time, there was no photo, just a single sheet of paper with a message written in the same neat handwriting as before. You can't hide from me. I moved out of that apartment within a week, breaking my lease and paying the penalties just to get away. I found a new place across town, a gated complex with security cameras and guards. I didn't tell anyone where I was moving, not even my closest friends, and I changed my phone number again. It's been a few months now, and I haven't received any more messages or found any more mysterious envelopes. But I can't relax. I'm always on edge, always wondering if they'll find me again. I don't use social media anymore, and I keep to myself as much as possible. I used to love going out, meeting friends, exploring the city, but now I'm too scared to do any of that. I've always been pretty active on Facebook Marketplace. Living in Chicago, it's a great way to find deals on furniture, electronics, and all sorts of random things people are trying to get rid of. I've bought and sold plenty of items over the years without any issues. So when I decided to sell an old dresser that was just taking up space, I didn't think twice about listing it on Marketplace. I took some pictures of the dresser, wrote up a quick description, and posted it for a reasonable price. Within a few hours, I got a message from someone interested. The profile looked normal enough. Just a regular guy, mid-30s, with a few photos of himself, some cars, and what I assumed were his kids. He asked if he could come by that evening to check out the dresser and potentially take it home. I agreed, figuring it would be an easy sale. Around 7 p.m., the guy showed up. He was friendly, maybe a little overly so, but nothing that set off any alarm bells. He introduced himself as Mike, complimented my apartment, and made some small talk about the neighborhood. He seemed normal, just a guy looking for a decent piece of furniture. We went into my living room where the dresser was, and he checked it out, opening the drawers, inspecting the wood, all the usual stuff. After a few minutes, he said he'd take it and offered to help me carry it down to his truck. I was relieved to be getting rid of it so easily and agreed. We carried the dresser down the 3 flights of stairs, loaded it into his truck, and he handed me the cash. He thanked me again, and I watched as he drove off. It wasn't until later that night, when I was lying in bed, that I realized something was bothering me. I replayed the interaction in my head, trying to pinpoint what felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I chalked it up to being tired and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to a strange feeling. I couldn't shake the thought that Mike had been a little too interested in my apartment. But again, I told myself I was overthinking it. He was just being friendly. Still, I decided to be a bit more cautious the next time I sold something online. A few days later, I noticed something strange. I had been sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone when I got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. When I came back, I noticed the curtains were slightly open. I distinctly remembered closing them earlier in the day, but maybe I had just brushed against them or something. I didn't think much of it at the time. That evening, I got a message on Facebook from Mike. It was out of the blue, just a casual, "Hey, how's it going?" I found it a bit odd since our transaction was over, but I responded politely, not wanting to be rude. He replied quickly, asking if I had any other furniture for sale. I told him I didn't, but if I decided to sell anything else, I'd let him know. I was hoping that would be the end of it. Over the next few days, I noticed small things around my apartment that didn't feel right. Objects seemed to have been moved slightly. Doors that I was sure I had closed were left ajar, and once I found a window in my bedroom slightly cracked open. I started to get paranoid, wondering if I was just being forgetful or if something more was going on. Then one night, I came home from work to find my front door unlocked. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew for a fact that I had locked it that morning. I slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside, my hand shaking as I reached for the light switch. The apartment looked normal. Nothing was missing or out of place. But the air felt heavy, like someone had been there. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I ended up spending the night at a friend's place, too scared to stay in my apartment. The next day, I had the locks changed and installed a deadbolt, hoping that would make me feel safer. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. I didn't hear from Mike again, and nothing strange happened at the apartment. I tried to convince myself that I had just been paranoid, that the stress of work and life had gotten to me. But then, about a week later, I received another message from Mike. This time, it wasn't a friendly greeting. The message was a photo of my apartment building, taken from across the street. The caption read, "Nice place, looks cozy." My stomach dropped. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. He had been watching me, and I had no idea for how long. I didn't respond to the message. Instead, I called the police and showed them the message, explaining what had been happening. They took it seriously, but there wasn't much they could do beyond taking a report and advising me to be cautious. They suggested I install security cameras, which I did immediately. The cameras gave me some peace of mind, but not much. Every time I left the apartment, I felt like I was being watched. I started avoiding walking past the windows, keeping the curtains closed at all times. I barely slept, and when I did, it was with the lights on, jumping at every noise. A few days after installing the cameras, I got another message from Mike. This time it was a video. My hands trembled as I opened it. The video was taken from outside my apartment, zooming in on my living room window. Through a gap in the curtains, you could see me sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The caption read, "You look lonely." I felt a surge of panic. How long had he been outside my apartment? How had he gotten so close without me noticing? I immediately called the police again and showed them the video. They sent an officer to patrol the area, but again, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to stay with someone else for a few days, which I did, but I knew I couldn't avoid going home forever. When I finally went back to my apartment, I was on edge, constantly checking the security cameras and keeping my phone in hand. I didn't get any more messages from Mike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. One night, as I was reviewing the footage from the security cameras, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In one of the videos from the night before, I saw a figure standing just out of the camera's view, partially obscured by a tree. They were there for hours, barely moving, just watching the building. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew it was him. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the person was long gone. They advised me to get a restraining order, but I didn't even know Mike's real name. His Facebook profile was generic, and I had no other information about him. I felt trapped, helpless, like there was no way out of this nightmare. The messages stopped after that, but I couldn't relax. I became a prisoner in my own home, too scared to leave, too scared to stay. Every time I heard a noise outside, I would freeze, wondering if he was back. I couldn't live like this, but I didn't know what else to do. Eventually, I decided to move out of the apartment. I found a new place across the city in a building with better security and a more secluded entrance. I didn't tell anyone where I was moving, and I deleted my Facebook account entirely. I hoped that by disappearing I could finally escape Mike and the terror he had brought into my life. I've always been the kind of person who likes to keep a low profile. I'm not a big fan of oversharing, and to be honest, Facebook was just another app I used to keep in touch with old friends and family. Nothing more, nothing less. I wasn't one of those people who posted every single detail of their life online. In fact, I was the opposite. I'd throw up a vacation pic once in a while, or maybe a snapshot from a random night out, but that was about it. Harmless stuff. or so I thought. This all happened last year. I was still living in Chicago at the time, in a pretty decent neighborhood on the north side. I had a regular 9-to-5 job downtown, nothing too exciting, but it paid the bills. I used Facebook mostly to keep up with my parents, who live out in Seattle, and some old friends I hadn't seen in years. Like most people, I had an account that I'd been using for years, since college. So there were a lot of old posts, photos, and random things I hadn't thought twice about in a long time. It all started one evening when I was sitting at home after work. I was scrolling through my phone, mindlessly flipping between apps, when I got a Facebook message from someone I didn't recognize. The profile picture was just a generic image, like one of those stock photos of a sunset. It wasn't uncommon for me to get random friend requests or messages from people I didn't know, so I didn't think much of it. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message simply said, "I have something you're going to want to see." Weird, right? But not totally out of the ordinary. People send strange messages online all the time. I figured it was spam or maybe someone trying to scam me. I debated whether to open the link attached to the message, but eventually I caved. Looking back, that was my first mistake. The link led me to a video hosted on some shady-looking website I'd never heard of before. I hesitated, but decided to watch it anyway, thinking it was probably some stupid prank or clickbait. As the video began to play, I immediately felt sick to my stomach. It was me, or at least it looked like me. In the video, I was sitting in some dingy room, clearly engaging in some sort of illegal activity. I couldn't tell where the video was shot, but it looked bad. Really bad. I was doing something I would never do in real life. Something that could ruin my life if it got out. At first, I thought it was a deep fake, a very convincing one. But there was something off about it. It wasn't just that it looked like me. It was that the person in the video was wearing clothes I actually owned, and the setting looked familiar too, though I couldn't quite place it. It freaked me out. I felt like I was looking at an alternate version of myself, like a twisted reflection in a funhouse mirror. But it wasn't me. I knew it wasn't me. I had never done anything like what I saw in that video. My mind started racing. Who made this? Why? What did they want from me? I started thinking about every single photo, every post I'd ever put on Facebook. Over the years, I had uploaded hundreds of pictures, status updates, and little snippets of my life. There were photos from vacations, work parties, nights out with friends, and even random selfies. I had always thought that sharing a few harmless photos couldn't hurt anyone. That my life wasn't interesting enough for anyone to care. Clearly, I was wrong. I clicked back to the message and read the rest of it. The person who sent it said that unless I paid them $5,000, they would release the video to my family, my friends, my co-workers, everyone. I couldn't believe what I was reading. They had even attached a list of names, people who were in my Facebook contacts, including my parents, my boss, and a few close friends. My heart started pounding. What the hell was I supposed to do? I didn't have that kind of money lying around. And even if I did, how could I be sure this person wouldn't just ask for more after I paid them? I felt trapped, completely helpless. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself over and over that the video wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the more I thought about it, the less sure I became. Deepfakes had become disturbingly realistic over the last few years. And even though I knew it wasn't me in that video, would other people believe me if they saw it? Or would they assume the worst, that I had some dark secret life I was hiding? That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the photos I'd posted over the years. My old college dorm, my first apartment, the bars I used to hang out at with friends, my trips to New York, Miami, and LA. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much information I had put out there. All of those little details, those seemingly innocent posts, had been pieced together by someone. They had probably spent months, maybe even years, collecting photos, videos, and posts, assembling them like a puzzle until they had enough to create this fake video. The next day at work, I could barely focus. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, terrified that it was another message from the blackmailer. I felt paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone was watching me. It was like I was living in a nightmare, and I couldn't wake up. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Not my friends, not my family. I was too embarrassed, too scared. I kept thinking, what if they don't believe me? What if they think I actually did something illegal? The shame alone was enough to keep me silent. Instead, I decided to fight back in the only way I could think of. I started researching deep fakes, looking for any way to discredit the video before it could ruin my life. I found countless stories online of people who had gone through something similar. People who had been blackmailed with fake videos or photos that looked almost identical to the real thing. But the more I read, the more hopeless I felt. In most cases, the victims had no way of proving the videos were fake. Even experts had trouble distinguishing between real footage and deep fakes. Eventually, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in cybercrime. He told me what I already knew. Paying the blackmailer wouldn't make the problem go away. If anything, it would only make it worse. But beyond that, there wasn't much he could do. There were no laws in place to protect people from deepfakes, no regulations that could prevent this from happening. It was the Wild West of the internet, and I was just another victim. In the weeks that followed, the messages from the blackmailer kept coming. They threatened to send the video to my boss, to post it publicly on YouTube, to ruin my entire life. I blocked the account, but they just made a new one and kept coming after me. I reported it to Facebook, but their response was slow and unhelpful. They didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of the situation. At some point, I stopped checking my messages altogether. I couldn't handle the anxiety anymore. Every time I got a notification, my stomach twisted into knots. It got to the point where I was afraid to even look at my phone. I became paranoid about everything. I deleted half my Facebook friends, scrubbed my profile of any old posts or photos that could be used against me, and set my account to the highest privacy settings possible. But the damage had already been done. The video was out there, floating in the dark corners of the internet, waiting to resurface. And I knew deep down that there was nothing I could do to stop it. Even if I could somehow prove it was fake, the mere existence of the video was enough to make people question me, to plant that seed of doubt in their minds. And that, more than anything, was what terrified me the most. In the end, the blackmailer never followed through on their threats. At least not yet. Maybe they got bored, or maybe they found someone else to target. I don't know. But I'm still living with the fear that one day, out of the blue, that video will resurface, and my life will be turned upside down all over again. The scariest part of this whole experience wasn't the video itself, though. It was the realization of just how vulnerable I really am. We all think we're safe behind our screens, that the things we post online can't hurt us. But the truth is, we're all just one click away from having our lives destroyed by someone we've never even met. And once it happens, there's no going back. It's been over a year since this all started, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I haven't heard from the blackmailer in months, but that doesn't mean I'm in the clear. The fear is always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Every time I log into Facebook, I wonder if today will be the day that everything falls apart. I've stopped posting online as much as I used to. I don't share personal photos anymore, and I never post about where I am or what I'm doing. I'm not writing this to scare anyone, though I guess it's inevitable that some people will be freaked out by my story. But I'm hoping that by sharing what happened to me, I can prevent someone else from going through the same thing. Don't be naive like I was. Don't assume that just because you're a private person, you're safe from this kind of stuff, because the truth is, none of us are. Last year, I found myself in need of a new car. My old Honda Accord, which I had for almost a decade, finally gave up the ghost after pushing it way past what it could handle. The repair costs were piling up, and after talking with my dad, we decided it wasn't worth the effort anymore. So I started looking for a replacement. I didn't have a huge budget, maybe around $5,000, so naturally I started scouring Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace for something reliable that wouldn't break the bank. At first, I wasn't having much luck. A lot of the listings were for beat-up cars that looked like they'd fall apart any day now, or they were ridiculously overpriced for what they were offering. I was getting frustrated after weeks of looking, but then one day I stumbled across this listing on Facebook Marketplace for a 2014 Toyota Camry. It was listed for $4,200, which was a pretty damn good price for that model and year, considering how well Toyotas tend to hold their value. The photos showed a clean car, no visible damage, low miles, and the seller's profile looked legit too. A guy named Jason from the suburbs, just a bit outside Detroit. I shot the seller a message and we started chatting. He told me he was selling the car because he had recently upgraded to a newer model and didn't need the old one anymore. He seemed nice enough and willing to answer all my questions. I asked for the VIN and he sent it over, so I did a quick check online to make sure everything was in order. The report came back clean, no accidents, no red flags. I was feeling pretty good about it, to be honest. It seemed like a straightforward deal, and the price was perfect for my budget. We set up a time to meet a few days later. Jason suggested meeting at a shopping plaza in Dearborn, which is a decent area just outside of Detroit. I thought it sounded reasonable. It was a public place with plenty of people around, which made me feel safer about the whole thing. I've bought and sold things through Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace before, and I always meet people in busy areas to avoid any sketchy situations. This seemed like no different. The day of the meetup, I left work a little early and drove to the plaza. It was one of those big ones with a Walmart, a few restaurants, and a bunch of smaller stores scattered around. It was late afternoon, still plenty of daylight, and the parking lot was busy. I pulled into a spot near the middle of the lot and texted Jason to let him know I was there. He replied pretty quickly, saying he was on his way and should be there in about 15 minutes. I told him no rush and just sat in my car, listening to some music while I waited. After about 10 minutes, I noticed a white van pull into the lot. It was one of those older models, the kind you see used for work or deliveries. It didn't really grab my attention at first, but as it got closer, I realized it was headed directly toward me. The van stopped a few spaces away from my car, and two guys stepped out. Neither of them looked like Jason from his profile picture, but I figured maybe he had brought a friend along. Not totally unusual, right? One of the guys, who looked to be in his early 30s, waved at me and started walking over. I rolled down my window, thinking he was going to introduce himself as Jason, but before I could even say anything, the other guy had already circled around to the passenger side of my car. I didn't have time to react before he yanked open the door and slid into the seat next to me. My stomach dropped. The guy who had waved at me was suddenly standing right outside my driver's side door, and before I could lock it, he pulled it open. I was trapped. I immediately realized I was in a bad situation. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe this was some sort of misunderstanding. The guy next to me leaned in close, and I saw that he had a gun tucked under his jacket. He didn't even have to pull it out. Just the sight of it made my blood run cold. He told me to get out of the car. His voice was low, calm, like he'd done this 100 times before. My hands were shaking, but I slowly unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out. The guy standing outside grabbed my arm and led me toward the van. Everything was happening so fast that I couldn't think straight. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. They shoved me into the back of the van, and the door slammed shut behind me. Inside, it was dark and cramped, with a strong smell of gasoline and sweat hanging in the air. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as they pushed me down onto the floor, binding my hands with zip ties. I tried to stay calm, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was completely helpless. The van started moving, and I could hear the two guys talking in low voices up front. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew it wasn't good. All I could think about was whether they were going to kill me or just rob me. I had no idea where we were headed or what they were planning to do. The ride felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably only about 15 or 20 minutes. I tried to keep track of the turns, hoping I could figure out where they were taking me, but I quickly lost track. Everything was a blur. I could feel every bump and pothole in the road as the van sped along, taking me further away from the safety of that parking lot. Finally, the van came to a stop. The doors swung open, and the two guys dragged me out. We were in some run-down industrial area, probably on the outskirts of town. There were no people around, just a few abandoned warehouses and a scattering of old shipping containers. It was the kind of place you only see in movies. The kind of place where bad things happen. They shoved me up against the side of one of the buildings and started going through my pockets. They took everything. My wallet, my phone, my car keys, even the few crumpled bills I had stuffed in my jeans. One of them pulled out my driver's license and stared at it for a few seconds before laughing quietly to himself. He pocketed it, and I knew then that they had everything they needed to track me down if I ever tried to go to the police. They didn't say much as they rifled through my stuff. The whole thing was eerily quiet, almost clinical. They weren't shouting or threatening me. They didn't have to. The gun was still visible under the jacket of the guy who seemed to be in charge, and that was enough to keep me from doing anything stupid. After they had taken everything, they cut the zip ties on my wrists and told me to get lost. That was it. No grand speeches, no threats. They just told me to walk. I couldn't believe it. I half expected them to shoot me in the back as I walked away, but they didn't. I just stood there for a moment trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. But then I realized I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. I started walking, not even sure where I was headed. My legs felt shaky, and I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified that the van would come back and they'd change their minds. I must have walked for miles, aimlessly wandering through the industrial district, until I finally found a gas station. The guy working inside gave me a strange look when I walked in, covered in dirt with no phone, no wallet, no ID. But he let me use the phone behind the counter to call my dad. That was one of the hardest calls I've ever had to make. My dad was a tough guy, Detroit born and raised. He had worked in the auto industry for over 30 years, and he wasn't one to show fear easily. But when I told him what had happened, I could hear the worry in his voice. He told me to stay put, that he'd come get me right away. I sat on the curb outside the gas station for what felt like hours, waiting for my dad to show up. Every car that passed made my heart skip a beat, thinking it might be the guys from the van coming back to finish the job. But eventually my dad pulled up in his old pickup truck. I climbed in, and for the first time since it all started, I felt a little bit safer. We didn't say much on the drive home. I could tell my dad was angry, but not at me. At the situation. At the fact that there wasn't much he could do to protect me from something like this. When we got back to the house, I just collapsed onto the couch, completely drained. For the next few days, I didn't leave the house. I didn't want to talk to anyone or deal with the outside world. I felt like an idiot for trusting a random person on Facebook Marketplace. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where I went wrong. I had always been so careful about meeting people in public places, making sure the situation seemed safe. But this time, none of that mattered. Eventually, I filed a police report, but I knew it wouldn't lead anywhere. The guys who did this were probably long gone, using fake names and burner phones to pull off their scams. The cops took down the details and promised to look into it, but I didn't hold out much hope. I figured my car was probably stripped for parts by now, and my wallet and phone were likely sold off within hours of them taking them. I stopped using Facebook Marketplace after that. I couldn't bring myself to trust anyone online anymore. Even now, months later, I still get nervous when I see a white van driving by or when I think about meeting up with someone to buy or sell something. It's a constant reminder that no matter how safe you think you are, there's always a chance that something like this could happen. This all happened last year, when I was living in Denver. I had moved there for a job in marketing a couple of years prior, and was still adjusting to the city. It's a beautiful place, especially if you're into outdoor activities, but the social scene can be a bit hit or miss. I didn't have a huge circle of friends there yet, but I had a solid group of co-workers and a few friends from college who had also ended up in Denver, so I wasn't lonely. One night, I decided to host a small party at my apartment. I live in a decent complex in Capitol Hill, nothing fancy, but the location is great. It's close to downtown and the area has a lot of character. I was excited to have a few friends over for drinks, music, and just a chill evening. It wasn't going to be a big thing, just 5 or 6 of us hanging out. I set up the Facebook event about a week before the party, but I kept it private. I didn't want random people seeing it, and I only invited the friends I actually wanted there. My thinking was that by keeping it private, I could control who knew about it and avoid any awkward situations with uninvited guests showing up. I didn't even post much about it on my regular profile. Just a vague status update that hinted at a low-key gathering with friends. Nothing that would draw too much attention. The days leading up to the party were uneventful. Work was busy, but I managed to get everything ready for the weekend. I had picked up snacks, drinks, and some decorations to make my place feel a bit more festive. It wasn't a huge event by any means, but I wanted to make sure my guests had a good time. The night of the party arrived, and everything was going smoothly. My friends started trickling in around 8 p.m., and we spent the first couple of hours just chatting, catching up on life, and having a few drinks. It was exactly the kind of relaxed, casual vibe I had hoped for. Around 10 p.m., though, something strange happened. My apartment has a buzzer system that guests need to use to get inside the building. When someone arrives, they buzz my apartment and I let them in. I had told everyone I invited to just text me when they arrived and I'd buzz them up. But at some point during the night, the buzzer went off unexpectedly. I assumed it was one of my friends, maybe someone who had left for a smoke or to grab something from their car. I didn't think much of it. I buzzed the person in without asking who it was. A few minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I was confused because all of my friends were already inside, but I figured maybe one of them had invited someone else without mentioning it. It happens, right? So I went to the door and opened it, expecting to see someone familiar. But the guy standing there wasn't anyone I recognized. He looked to be in his mid-30s. a bit older than the rest of us, with scruffy hair and a disheveled appearance. He was holding a beer bottle in his hand, and he smiled at me like we knew each other. I was immediately on edge. He wasn't dressed for a casual party either. He had on a dirty jacket and worn-out jeans like he had just wandered in off the street. I asked him who he was and what he was doing there, trying to keep my voice calm. He said he had heard about the party from a friend and thought it would be fun to stop by. I felt a wave of confusion and unease wash over me. I didn't know this guy, and I certainly hadn't invited him. I told him that this was a private event and that he must have made a mistake, but he didn't leave. Instead, he started talking about how he had seen the Facebook event and figured it would be okay to join in. That's when my stomach dropped. The event was private. There was no way he should have known about it unless someone had shared the details with him. But I'd only invited a few close friends, and I trusted all of them. None of them would have shared the invite with a random stranger. I quickly realized that something wasn't right. I tried to stay polite but firm, telling him again that this was a private party and he needed to leave. He didn't argue, but the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He finally shrugged and said he'd leave, but as he turned to go, he muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make out exactly what he said, but it sounded like, "See you around." I shut the door and locked it immediately. My friends were all inside, still having a good time, oblivious to what had just happened. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to brush it off and rejoin the party. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. How did that guy know about my party? And why did he seem so casual about crashing it? As the night went on, I kept thinking about it, and I started to feel more and more anxious. Every time I heard a noise in the hallway or the sound of a car outside, my heart would race. I was on edge, and I couldn't relax. Eventually, the party started winding down and my friends began to head home. I was relieved when the last person left, and I locked up my apartment, feeling a bit safer now that I was alone. The next day, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I figured it was just some random weirdo who had stumbled across the event somehow. And I didn't want to overthink it, but that uneasy feeling stuck with me, nagging at the back of my mind. A few days later, something even stranger happened. I was scrolling through Facebook when I got a friend request from someone I didn't recognize. The profile picture was just a blurry image of a street corner, and the name was something generic like John Smith. It didn't raise any immediate red flags, but there was something about the request that made me hesitate. I clicked on the profile and looked through the limited information that was available. There were only a handful of posts, none of which revealed much about the person. The account looked like it had been recently created, with very few friends or interactions. It seemed odd, but I figured it was just another random request from someone I didn't know. I declined it and moved on, not thinking much of it. That night, though, I got another message. This time, it wasn't a friend request. It was a direct message from a different account, again with a vague profile picture and a generic name. The message just asked how I was doing, followed by a smiley face. I ignored it, but the uneasy feeling from the party started creeping back into my mind. Over the next few days, I got more and more of these weird messages from different accounts. All of them were friendly on the surface, but there was something off about them. None of the profiles had any real information, and they all seemed new, like they had been created just to send these messages. I started to feel paranoid, wondering if someone was watching me or tracking my activity online. Then one evening I got another knock at my door. It was late, probably around 9 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and there was another unfamiliar face. This time it was a woman, maybe in her early 40s, standing there with a nervous smile. She didn't look threatening, but I wasn't about to open the door. I asked who she was through the door, and she said she was a friend of a friend and had heard about the party. I felt a surge of panic. That party had happened days ago, and I hadn't mentioned it to anyone since. I hadn't posted about it on Facebook or told anyone else. How was this happening again? I told her there was no party and that she needed to leave. She didn't argue, but as she walked away, I saw her pull out her phone and start texting someone. I stood there, frozen, watching her walk down the hallway and disappear around the corner. I spent the next few hours sitting in my living room, my mind racing. Who were these people? And how were they finding me? Was someone stalking me? I checked my Facebook privacy settings again, making sure everything was locked down as tightly as possible. But I still couldn't figure out how these random people were showing up at my door, claiming to know about a party that had long since ended. A couple of days later, I was walking home from work when I noticed someone following me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, the same guy was there, keeping his distance but never letting me out of his sight. He was dressed casually, nothing that would make him stand out, but the way he was watching me made my skin crawl. I didn't want to lead him back to my apartment, so I took a detour, heading into a busy coffee shop near downtown. I sat there for a while, sipping a coffee and trying to calm my nerves. After about an hour, I cautiously made my way home, taking a different route to make sure I wasn't being followed. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was exhausted. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any proof that someone was stalking me, and even if I did, I wasn't sure the police would take me seriously. I hadn't been threatened directly, but the constant messages, the strange people showing up at my door, and the feeling of being followed were wearing me down. Over the next few weeks, the messages slowed down, but they never completely stopped. Every now and then, I'd get a random friend request or a message from a fake-looking account. I blocked every one of them, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I stopped using Facebook as much, and when I did, I was careful not to post anything too personal. I even considered deleting my account entirely, but I hesitated, thinking that maybe it would make things worse if I suddenly disappeared from social media. The strange encounters at my door also became less frequent. One day I was talking to a coworker about it, trying to explain what I had been going through. She listened quietly and then asked me if I had ever heard of Facebook event stalking. I hadn't, so she explained that it was a growing issue where people would use social media to track others through their event invites, even if the events were private. Sometimes they would create fake profiles to join groups or friend lists, just to get access to personal details. It sounded insane, but the more she talked about it, the more it made sense. I realized then that I had been far too trusting with my online presence. Even though I thought I had been careful, I hadn't taken the potential dangers seriously enough. I had allowed too much information to slip through the cracks, and now I was paying the price. 2021 was the worst year of my life. It all started out so normal, just another year in my late 20s, working the same job, living in the same apartment in Cleveland, and using Facebook like everyone else. I wasn't one of those obsessive types who posted every single meal or checked in at every place I went to. But, like most people, I used Facebook to stay in touch with friends and family, and to stay in the loop with my local community. I live in a quiet neighborhood just outside of downtown, My apartment is nothing special, just a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a modest building. It's not a bad place, though. It's close enough to the action, but far enough away that I don't have to deal with too much of the noise and chaos. It's one of those neighborhoods where people leave each other alone for the most part. But you see the same faces often enough to recognize them. You know, the kind of place where you nod politely at people you don't really know, but you still feel a sense of community. This past spring, I decided to expand my social circle a little bit. I had been in Cleveland for a few years, and I knew a few people, but I wasn't as connected as I wanted to be. A lot of my friends had moved away or drifted apart over time, and I found myself spending too many weekends alone in my apartment, scrolling through my phone and watching Netflix. I started thinking it might be time to get more involved in the local scene. Facebook seemed like the easiest way to do that. I joined a couple of local groups, one for young professionals in Cleveland, another for community events in my neighborhood. Through those groups, I started friending people who seemed cool or who had mutual connections with other people I knew. Nothing too crazy, just adding a few new faces here and there. I figured worst case I'd meet some new friends to hang out with on the weekends. Everything seemed fine at first. A few people I added even reached out to chat, and I had a few conversations with some of them. We talked about the usual stuff, local restaurants, events, hobbies. It was nice to feel like I was expanding my social network, but looking back I realize now that I wasn't nearly as careful as I should have been. I didn't really know these people. I didn't know what they were really about. One of the people I added was a guy named Mark. His profile seemed pretty normal. Just some photos of him at local spots, a few posts about music and sports. Nothing that raised any red flags. He was a friend of someone I knew from college, so when he sent me a friend request, I didn't think much of it. We chatted a little bit about a local concert that was coming up, and I even ran into him at a bar downtown once. We said hey, exchanged a few words, and that was about it. I didn't think anything more of it at the time. A couple of months later, I was planning a weekend trip to visit my parents in Columbus. I hadn't seen them in a while, and I figured it would be nice to get out of the city for a few days. As usual, I posted a quick status update on Facebook about my trip. I didn't think twice about it. I wasn't one of those people who shared every little detail of their life online, but I didn't see any harm in letting people know where I was headed for the weekend. The weekend came and went without any issues. I had a good time with my parents, catching up and relaxing. It was nice to take a break from work and the city for a bit. I got back to Cleveland on Sunday evening feeling refreshed and ready for the week ahead. Little did I know, everything was about to change. When I got back to my apartment, something felt off. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was this strange sense that something wasn't right. I walked through the front door, and that's when I saw it, the mess. My apartment had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, papers and clothes were scattered all over the floor, and my electronics were gone. My laptop, my TV, my gaming console, they were all missing. My stomach dropped. My first thought was that I had been robbed, but then I started noticing the smaller details. It wasn't just that my stuff was gone. It was that the burglars seemed to know exactly what to take. They had rifled through my desk and taken my external hard drive, which had all of my personal files on it. They had taken my old camera, which I hadn't used in years, but they left behind some other things that seemed more valuable at first glance. It was like they knew exactly what they were looking for. I called the police, of course, and they came to take a report. They dusted for fingerprints and asked me a bunch of questions, but I could tell they weren't optimistic about catching whoever did this. The officer told me that apartment break-ins like this were usually random, that it was probably just some local kids looking for quick cash. But something about it didn't feel random to me. I started thinking about how the burglars knew I wouldn't be home. I hadn't told many people about my trip to Columbus, just a few close friends and family. The only other place I had mentioned it was on Facebook. And that's when it hit me. Someone on my friends list must have seen my post and used that information to break into my apartment while I was gone. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. I started going through my Facebook friends list, trying to figure out who might have been behind it. I had over 500 friends on there, people from all different stages of my life. But how many of them did I actually know? How many of them could I actually trust? Then I remembered Mark. He was one of the newer friends I had added, and something about him started to feel off. I hadn't talked to him much since that initial conversation about the concert, but I remembered seeing some of his posts about local events and bars. He seemed like the kind of guy who knew a lot of people in the area. Maybe even the kind of person who would hear about things like break-ins. I started to wonder if he had something to do with it. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random burglary. Whoever did this knew too much about me, when I would be gone, what valuable items I had in my apartment, where I kept my important files. It was like they had been watching me, tracking my movements, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with finding out who was behind the break-in. I went through every detail of my Facebook activity, trying to figure out if I had let something slip that gave them the information they needed. I started to notice things I hadn't paid attention to before. Posts where I had mentioned my schedule, photos that showed the layout of my apartment, even check-ins at local places that could have tipped someone off about my routines. I also started paying more attention to Mark's posts. He was always posting about being out and about in Cleveland, but something about his posts started to feel calculated, like he was trying to build this persona of being a friendly, social guy while keeping an eye on what other people were doing. I couldn't prove it, but I started to suspect that he wasn't just some random guy I had met through Facebook. He was someone who had been watching me, waiting for an opportunity to take advantage of me. As the weeks went on, I couldn't shake the paranoia. I started seeing connections everywhere. Other people I had recently added on Facebook, people who I didn't know all that well, suddenly seemed suspicious. I started unfriending people, locking down my privacy settings, and being extremely careful about what I posted. I even stopped checking in at places or posting about my plans in advance. But the damage was already done. A few months after the break-in, I got a call from the police. They had caught the guys who had broken into my apartment. It turns out they were part of a small group of local criminals who had been targeting people through social media. They would add people as friends on Facebook, monitor their posts, and then use that information to plan break-ins when they knew the person wouldn't be home. And Mark? He was one of them. When the police told me that Mark had been involved, I felt sick to my stomach. He had been watching me the whole time, using my Facebook posts to figure out when I would be out of town and what he could steal from my apartment. I had let him into my life without even realizing it, and he had taken advantage of that trust in the worst possible way. After the police caught Mark and his crew, I thought I would feel some sense of relief. But that's not what happened. Instead, I felt more paranoid than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily it had all happened. How I had unknowingly given a criminal access to my life just by being careless on social media. I had thought I was being smart and cautious, but in reality, I had made myself a target without even realizing it. I started questioning everything I did online. Every post, Every friend request, every interaction felt like a potential threat. I stopped using Facebook altogether for a while, but even that didn't make me feel any safer. The damage was done, and the feeling of violation wasn't something that could be undone by simply deleting an app. It's been almost 3 years now since the break-in, and while things have calmed down, I'm still incredibly careful about what I share online. I've cut my friends list down to only people I know and trust, and I've made my privacy settings as tight as possible. I've always been really into gardening. It's kind of been my thing since I was a kid, something I picked up from my grandma. She had this big backyard filled with flowers, vegetables, herbs. You name it, she could grow it. I think that's where I got the bug for it. After I bought my own little house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Portland, I was excited to finally have space for my own garden. Nothing too crazy, just a small backyard that I could turn into a nice little haven. For the first couple of years, it was mostly trial and error. I'd post about my garden here and there on Facebook or Instagram, just to share my progress with friends and family. It wasn't like I had a huge following or anything, just a few dozen likes here and there from people I knew. It felt good to show off a little, especially after spending so much time and effort working on it. Eventually, I joined a few gardening groups on Facebook. These groups were pretty active, filled with people from all over the country and even some international folks who shared tips, photos, and advice. It was really helpful, actually. Whenever I had a question about something, I'd post it in the group and get a bunch of responses. People were usually friendly, eager to help, and some even recognized me after a while because I posted pretty regularly. One of the groups was local to Portland, which was great because people would share specific advice for the climate here. You know, what plants work best in the rainy seasons, how to deal with certain pests in the area, that sort of thing. It was comforting in a way to connect with others who shared my interests. There was a sense of community in these groups that made it feel more personal. We all loved gardening, and we were just there to help each other out. I started sharing more and more, especially when I renovated my backyard last spring. I had saved up for a few years to do it properly. New fencing, fresh sod, a few raised beds for vegetables, and a little area where I could plant some flowers and shrubs. I even installed a small pond with a few koi fish. It was the kind of backyard I'd always wanted, and I was proud of it. Naturally, I posted a lot of pictures in the Facebook group showing the progress step by step. People seemed to really like it, and I got a lot of compliments. That's where this whole thing started, I guess. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, that's when I made a mistake. A big one. I had posted a picture of the finished backyard, talking about how I'd finally gotten everything the way I wanted it. In the caption, I mentioned that I lived alone and how much I enjoyed having my own space to work in. It seemed innocent enough at the time. I wasn't thinking about anything other than how proud I was of my work. Over the next few weeks, I kept posting updates here and there, little things, like when my tomatoes started coming in or when I added a new flower bed. One day, though, I noticed something strange. I got a message from someone in the gardening group, a guy I didn't recognize. His profile picture was just a close-up of some plants, so I couldn't tell much from that. The message was weird, though. It wasn't like the usual ones I'd get asking for advice or giving compliments. He just asked me if I lived near a certain neighborhood in Portland. It threw me off. I hadn't mentioned my specific neighborhood in any of my posts. I had kept things pretty vague, just talking about Portland in general. I ignored the message at first, chalking it up to someone just being overly friendly or curious. But it stuck with me. A few days later, the same guy messaged me again, this time asking about my garden directly. He mentioned specific details, things that I hadn't talked about in the group, like the layout of my backyard and where I had placed certain plants. That really freaked me out. I went back through my posts, trying to see if maybe I had accidentally given away more information than I thought. I didn't remember posting anything that detailed, but the more I scrolled, the more I started to worry. It was possible, I realized, that someone could piece things together from my pictures and captions. Maybe I had been too casual about what I was sharing. I didn't respond to the guy's second message, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started feeling uneasy, like maybe I had made a mistake by being so open in the group. I debated whether to leave the group altogether, but it felt like an overreaction. It was just one guy, right? Maybe he was just a little too interested in my garden. But then things got worse. A few nights later, I was sitting in my living room, just relaxing after work. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and I was flipping through channels on TV when I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some animal rustling around in the bushes. I live in a quiet area, so noises like that aren't uncommon. But then I heard it again, this time louder, like someone was walking around in my backyard. My heart started racing. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got up and went to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. In the dim light, I saw a figure moving through my garden. My stomach dropped. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes, crouched low near one of the flower beds. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was definitely there, moving deliberately, like he was searching for something. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the couch just a few steps away, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just stood there, watching this stranger in my backyard, terrified that if I made any noise, he would notice me. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally stood up and walked toward the back fence. He climbed over it quickly and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the empty yard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I grabbed my phone and called the police. When they arrived, I told them what I had seen, but there wasn't much they could do. The guy was long gone by the time they showed up, and there wasn't any clear evidence that he had taken anything. The officers walked around the yard, shining their flashlights into the bushes and checking the fence, but they didn't find anything. They told me to be careful and to call them again if anything else happened. That was it. I locked up my house as best as I could, but I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound outside made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the man might come back. The next day, I tried to act like everything was normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man in my yard. Who was he? Why was he there? Was it just some random prowler, or was it something more? I started going through my Facebook messages again, and that's when I saw it. Another message from the same guy in the gardening group. This time, he didn't ask any questions. He just sent a single word. Nice garden. That was it. No explanation, no context. Just those 2 words. My heart started pounding. I knew it had to be him. The guy in my backyard. He had seen my garden, the one I had posted all those pictures of. He knew where I lived. Or at least he had figured it out somehow. I felt sick to my stomach. I had been so careless posting all those details online, never thinking that someone might use that information against me. I blocked him immediately, but the damage was already done. I couldn't stop thinking about how he had found me, how he had been in my yard, right outside my house. I went through all of my posts again, deleting anything that seemed too personal, anything that might give away more information than I had intended. But it was too late. He already knew where I lived. For the next few weeks, I was on edge constantly. I started leaving the lights on in my backyard at night, hoping that it would deter anyone from creeping around. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows before bed, and I stopped posting anything online about my garden or my home. But the fear never went away. Every time I walked into my backyard, I felt exposed, like someone could be watching me from the shadows. One night, a couple of weeks after the first incident, it happened again. I was asleep when I heard a noise outside, this time louder, like something had fallen over. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and ran to the window. Sure enough, there was someone in my backyard again. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called the police immediately. They arrived quickly, and this time, they found something. One of the officers spotted a shoe print in the dirt near the fence, and they said it looked fresh. They didn't find the guy, but at least now they had some evidence that someone had been there. They told me to be careful, to keep my doors and windows locked, and to call them if anything else happened. After that, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped gardening altogether. It broke my heart because it was something I had loved for so long, but I couldn't enjoy it anymore. Every time I stepped into my backyard, all I could think about was that man, the one who had been watching me, creeping around in the dark. I eventually moved out of that house, away from the neighborhood I had once loved. I never went back to the gardening groups on Facebook, and I became extremely cautious about what I shared online. This story starts about a year ago. I was scrolling through Facebook on a Friday night, just mindlessly looking through posts, when I got a friend request from someone I didn't recognize. The profile picture was of a woman, a really attractive woman. Her name was Jessica. I didn't remember meeting her anywhere, but her profile looked real enough. She had a few dozen friends, some photos and posts that went back several months. I figured maybe she was someone I had met through mutual friends or maybe even at a work event. It wasn't totally unusual for me to get random friend requests like this from time to time, so I didn't think too much of it. I accepted the request, and a few days later she messaged me. The conversation started off pretty innocently, just small talk. She mentioned that she had found me through a mutual friend, though she didn't specify who, and that she was new to Philly. She seemed friendly, and honestly, I was a bit flattered that someone like her would take the time to message me. I'm not exactly what you'd call a ladies' man, so I was excited about the attention, even though I tried not to get too ahead of myself. Over the next couple of weeks, we chatted more and more. It started off casual, but then it got a little flirty. She complimented me on my looks, told me she liked my sense of humor, and even started hinting that she wanted to meet up in person at some point. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't into it. It felt good to have someone show interest in me, especially since I had been single for a while and hadn't really been putting myself out there much. Things escalated pretty quickly after that. Jessica started sending me some pretty provocative messages, along with a few photos that left little to the imagination. I was shocked at first. This kind of thing had never happened to me before, but I got caught up in it. She was so forward, so confident, and I guess that pulled me in. She kept asking me to send her some photos in return, and eventually I caved. I wasn't proud of it, but I sent her a few pictures. Nothing too crazy, but still enough to make me feel a little uneasy afterward. At first, everything seemed fine. We kept talking, and she seemed even more interested in meeting up. But then, things took a turn. A couple of days after I sent her the photos, she messaged me again. But this time the tone was completely different. She wasn't flirty or friendly anymore. Instead, she sent me a long message saying that unless I sent her money, she was going to share the photos I had sent her with all of my Facebook friends, including my family and coworkers. She even sent me screenshots of my friend list to prove that she wasn't bluffing. I remember feeling like my heart had just stopped when I read that message. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was like the ground had dropped out from under me. She had seemed so real, so genuine. But now I was realizing that I had fallen for some kind of scam. I had no idea what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore her and hope that it was just a bluff, but the other part of me was terrified that she really would follow through with her threat. I asked her how much she wanted, and she said $500. She gave me her PayPal information and told me that if I didn't send the money within 24 hours, she'd send the photos to everyone on my friends list. She even reminded me of a few specific people like my mom, my boss, and a couple of old friends from college, just to make sure I knew she was serious. I couldn't believe what was happening. I had always thought I was smart enough to avoid stuff like this, but I had let my guard down. I was so embarrassed, so ashamed, and I was terrified of what would happen if those photos got out. It would ruin me, professionally and personally. I was supposed to be the guy who had it together, but now I was at the mercy of some stranger who had manipulated me into this situation. I spent the entire night panicking. I barely slept, and when I did, I had nightmares about people seeing those photos, about losing my job, about my mom finding out. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't see any other way out. I sent her the money. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. A couple of days later, she messaged me again, demanding more money. This time, she wanted $1,000. I had hoped that once I paid her the first time, she'd leave me alone, but now I realized that she was never going to stop. She had me on the hook, and she wasn't going to let go until she had drained me of everything she could. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have that kind of money lying around. And even if I did, I knew that paying her again wouldn't make this go away. It would only make it worse. But I couldn't go to the police. What was I going to tell them? That I had sent explicit photos to some random person on the internet? I felt like such an idiot, like this was all my fault. I tried to reason with her, to tell her that I didn't have the money, but she didn't care. She just kept threatening me, saying that if I didn't pay up, she'd send the photos to everyone. I could feel the walls closing in around me. I didn't see a way out of this. That's when I decided to reach out to a friend of mine who worked in cybersecurity. I hadn't told anyone about what was going on up until that point, but I was desperate, and I needed help. I called him up and told him everything about Jessica, the photos, the blackmail. I was embarrassed, but he was surprisingly understanding. He didn't judge me. He just listened and told me that I wasn't the first person this had happened to. He explained that this was a common scam, catfishing it's called, where scammers create fake profiles to lure people in, get them to send compromising photos or information, and then blackmail them for money. He told me that once they had their hooks in, they rarely let go unless they thought they couldn't get any more out of you. He also warned me that paying her again wouldn't stop her. It would only encourage her to keep asking for more. He helped me report the profile to Facebook, and he walked me through the process of blocking her on all social media platforms. He also recommended that I change all of my passwords and take steps to protect my accounts in case she had managed to gain access to any of them. For the next few days, I was a nervous wreck. I was constantly checking my Facebook, my email, and my phone, waiting for some sign that she had followed through on her threats. But nothing happened. The profile disappeared, and I never heard from her again. I got lucky, I guess. She must have moved on to her next victim when she realized I wasn't going to pay her anymore. But the damage had been done. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the fear that someone could use my own actions against me like that. I had let my guard down, and I had paid the price. It's been a while since all of this happened, and I've taken a lot of steps to protect myself online since then. I'm much more careful about who I talk to on social media, and I've tightened up all of my privacy settings. I don't add people I don't know anymore, no matter how real their profile seems, and I don't send photos like that to anyone, no matter how much I think I can trust them. But the fear still lingers. Every time I get a friend request from someone I don't recognize, I feel a knot in my stomach. I can't help but wonder if it's going to happen again, if I'm going to fall for another scam. It's a fear that never really goes away, even after you've moved on from the initial shock of it. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you can never be too careful online. No matter how real someone seems, you never really know who's on the other side of that screen. And once you've made a mistake, there's no taking it back. All you can do is try to learn from it and protect yourself from it happening again. I'm sharing this because I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. It's easy to think that you're smart enough to avoid these kinds of scams, that it could never happen to you. But the truth is, it can happen to anyone. These people are experts at what they do. They know how to make you feel comfortable, how to gain your trust, and how to exploit your weaknesses. Don't let yourself become their next victim. Be careful about who you talk to online, and be cautious about what you share. It's better to be safe than sorry. This all started 2 years ago when I decided to share some memories from my childhood. I've always been a nostalgic person. My family moved around a lot when I was younger, and I've lived in cities all over the Midwest. I guess that's why I liked looking back at old photos. Those pictures were my way of staying connected to all the places and people I had left behind. So one weekend, I was going through some old photo albums at my apartment in Milwaukee. I hadn't gone through them in years, and flipping through the pages brought back all kinds of memories. There were pictures of family holidays, birthdays, my old house, my elementary school friends, and even some random shots of the neighborhood where I grew up. It made me feel connected to a time when life was simpler. I decided to scan a few of the pictures and post them on Facebook. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, just thought it would be fun to share some old memories with my friends and family. Most of them had never seen these photos before, and I figured it might be a nice way to reconnect with people I hadn't talked to in a while. I posted a few of my favorite ones. A photo of my old house in Ohio, a picture of me and my siblings playing in the yard, and a couple of shots from various family vacations. The response was pretty normal at first. People liked the photos, left comments about how cute I was as a kid, and some even shared their own childhood memories in the comments. It felt like a wholesome little moment of nostalgia. But then, after a few days, things started to get weird. I received a private message from someone I didn't recognize. His profile picture was generic, a landscape shot of some random street, and his name didn't ring any bells. The message itself was short and casual. He said he had seen the photos I posted and that they reminded him of his own childhood. He mentioned that he had grown up in Ohio as well, and that my old house looked similar to one he used to pass by on his way to school. At first, I didn't think much of it. I responded politely, telling him that I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and I asked if he was from the same area. We exchanged a few more messages, just casual conversation about our childhoods. He didn't say anything alarming, and his questions seemed innocent enough. I figured he was just another person who had stumbled across my post and was feeling nostalgic like I was. But then, his messages started getting a bit more specific. He asked me if I remembered certain places in the town, places I hadn't mentioned in my post. He asked if I remembered a park that used to be near my old house, and if I had ever gone to a certain corner store down the street. That's when I started feeling a little uneasy. I hadn't mentioned any of those details in my post, and I couldn't figure out how he knew about them. I asked him if he had grown up in the same town, thinking maybe he was just someone who had lived nearby and recognized the area from the photos. But his response was vague. He didn't directly answer my question, and instead just said something like how the world is a small place. That didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something felt off. I decided to stop responding to his messages. I didn't block him or anything. At that point, I didn't think it was necessary. I just figured if I ignored him, he'd lose interest and move on. For a few days, things were quiet. I didn't hear from him again, and I started to forget about the whole thing. Then one evening, I received another message from him. This time, it wasn't just small talk. He sent me a photo. It was a picture of my old house, the same house I had posted in my original Facebook post. But it wasn't one of the photos I had shared. This was a new picture, taken from a different angle, as if someone had stood across the street and snapped it recently. The house looked the same, but it had aged. The yard was overgrown, and the paint on the shutters had started to peel. It was clear that this wasn't an old photo from my childhood. It was recent. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. How did he have this picture? I hadn't been back to that house in years. My family had moved away long ago, and as far as I knew, it was now owned by someone else. The whole thing sent a chill down my spine. It was one thing for this guy to talk about places in my old town, but it was another for him to have a recent picture of my childhood home. I replied, asking him how he had the photo. His response was short and unsettling. He said that he passed by it recently and thought I might like to see how it looked now. That didn't make any sense to me. I had never told him the exact address, and even if he had somehow figured it out, why would he go out of his way to take a picture of it? At that point, I started to get really freaked out. I blocked him immediately and went back to my Facebook posts, making everything private. I deleted the photos I had shared and locked down my account as much as possible. I figured that would be the end of it, that once he realized he couldn't contact me anymore, he'd move on. But it didn't end there. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. I wasn't expecting anything, so when I saw the envelope with no return address, I was curious but cautious. I opened it and my heart sank. Inside was another photo, this time of my current apartment building in Milwaukee. It was taken from across the street, just like the photo of my old house. The picture showed the entrance to the building, and in the corner of the photo, I could see my car parked in its usual spot. There was no note with the photo, just the image itself, like a silent message meant to let me know that someone had found me. I felt sick. My mind started racing with questions. How did he know where I lived? Had he followed me? Was he watching me? I called the police and reported the letter, but there wasn't much they could do. They took down the information and told me to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. But without any real evidence of a threat, they couldn't do much more than that. They suggested I get a security camera for my apartment just in case, and told me to report anything else that seemed off. For the next few weeks, I was constantly on edge. Every time I left my apartment, I found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone was watching me. I started taking different routes to work, parking my car in different spots and avoiding going out at night. I even stopped using Facebook altogether, terrified that somehow this guy was still keeping tabs on me. One night I came home from work late. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. As I walked up to my apartment building, I noticed something on the ground near my front door. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash or maybe a flyer that someone had left, but when I got closer, I saw that it was another photo. This time, it was a picture of me. The photo had clearly been taken without my knowledge. It showed me walking down the street, probably on my way to work. I was looking down at my phone, completely unaware that someone had been there, watching me taking pictures. My heart raced as I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty. I went inside and called the police again. They came by and took the photo, but once again there wasn't much they could do. There was no way to trace where the photo had come from, and they couldn't prove that it was connected to the previous incidents. They told me to be careful and suggested that I might want to stay with a friend or family member for a while, just to be safe. I ended up staying with a friend for a few nights, but even that didn't make me feel completely safe. The idea that someone had been following me, taking pictures of me, and sending them to me without any clear motive was terrifying. I couldn't shake the fear that this person was still out there watching, waiting for the right moment to do something worse. After a week of staying with my friend, I decided to go back to my apartment. I couldn't live in fear forever, and I hoped that maybe the whole thing had blown over. But when I got home, I found another letter waiting for me. Inside was a note, just a single sentence, written in neat, precise handwriting. It said, "I'll always know where you are." That was the last straw for me. I packed up my things and moved out of that apartment within a week. I didn't care about breaking my lease or losing my security deposit. I just needed to get out. I moved to a different part of the city, changed my phone number, and completely deleted my Facebook account. I even stopped using social media altogether, too afraid that somehow this person would find me again. It's been almost a year and a half since I moved, and while I haven't received any more letters or photos, the fear hasn't gone away. I still don't know who that person was or why they targeted me. I don't know how they found my childhood home or how they tracked me down in Milwaukee. And the worst part is, I'll probably never know. I always thought I was pretty careful online. I don't consider myself overly paranoid, but I don't post every detail of my life either. I've got a decent job at a tech firm in Dallas, and between that and keeping up with family and friends back in Chicago, Facebook was mostly just a way to stay in touch with people, the usual. Checking in, sharing funny memes, catching up with high school friends I hadn't seen in years. Nothing too personal. It was just part of the background noise of life. Then, a few months ago, something happened that completely changed the way I see social media. It started with a seemingly innocent notification. I remember I was sitting at my desk at work, just going through emails and sipping my coffee when my phone buzzed. It was a Facebook notification telling me my account had been logged into from a new location. At first, I didn't think much of it. These things happen, right? Sometimes Facebook just glitches and sends you a warning for no reason. But then I got another notification, this time saying my password had been changed. My heart skipped a beat. I knew immediately that something was wrong. I tried to log in, but I was already locked out. My password wasn't working, and no matter what I did, I couldn't regain access. Panic started to set in as I realized someone had taken control of my account. I followed the usual steps, clicked, forgot password, tried to reset it, but I never got the recovery email. I checked my spam folder, refreshed my inbox, but there was nothing. I tried again, thinking maybe I had mistyped something, but still no luck. My account was completely out of my hands. Whoever had taken it had already changed the email address associated with my account. They had locked me out of my own life. At first, I was just annoyed. I figured I'd contact Facebook support, they'd sort it out, and I'd get my account back in no time. But getting through to Facebook was like trying to yell through a brick wall. I filled out their forms, sent in requests, but all I got back were automated responses telling me to follow the steps I had already tried. It felt like I was screaming into the void while someone else was out there controlling my online presence. Hours passed, and I still couldn't get into my account. What made it worse was that I started getting texts from friends. They were asking me about weird messages they'd been receiving from my profile. Some of the messages were asking for money, claiming I was in an emergency situation and needed help. Others were just random links to sketchy websites. One of my friends told me she had clicked on one of the links, and her account got flooded with spam afterward. She was pissed, and I didn't blame her. I realized then that whoever had hijacked my account wasn't just locking me out. They were actively using it to scam people I knew. I felt sick to my stomach. My Facebook wasn't just mine anymore. It was being used to trick and manipulate people in my life, people who trusted me. I tried to warn everyone. I sent out mass texts and posted on Instagram, since that account was still safe, telling people not to trust anything that came from my Facebook profile. But by then, the damage had already been done. I found out later that a few of my friends had actually sent money to the scammer thinking they were helping me out of some dire situation. They were out hundreds of dollars because of it. I couldn't believe this was happening. As the day went on, the messages from friends kept coming. They started telling me about even more personal-sounding messages. The hacker wasn't just sending out generic requests for money anymore. They were using information from my old Facebook messages, private conversations I had with people, and using that to manipulate them. They knew details about my life, my friends, my family. They were using my own words against the people I cared about. I felt completely powerless. Every attempt I made to regain control of my account was met with dead ends. Facebook's security process was slow, and the more time passed, the more damage this person was doing. I didn't know what to do. It was like someone had hijacked a part of my life, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. A couple of days passed, and I was still locked out. By then, I had reached out to pretty much everyone I knew, trying to warn them. But the hacker didn't stop. They kept sending messages, kept trying to scam people. Some of my friends started blocking me on Facebook just to stop the messages from coming. I didn't blame them, but it still hurt. My own account was being used to push people away from me. One morning, I woke up to find that things had gotten even worse. My phone was blowing up with notifications from people I hadn't talked to in years, old coworkers, distant relatives, even some people I had completely forgotten about. The hacker had started sending out mass friend requests to random people on my friends list. They were spreading the scam even further, using my identity to target more and more people. And I couldn't do anything about it. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was humiliating. My entire digital presence had been taken over, and it felt like I was watching someone parade around in my skin. They were impersonating me, making me look like a scam artist, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I felt like I was losing control of my own identity. Then, about a week after the initial hack, things took an even darker turn. I started getting calls from family members. They were panicked, saying that someone had been messaging them from my account, threatening them. They were receiving personal threats, things that referenced specific details about their lives. The hacker was using information from old Facebook posts and messages to target them, digging into their fears and using it against them. That was the breaking point for me. I realized that this wasn't just some random scammer looking for quick cash. This was something more personal, more malicious. Whoever had taken over my account wasn't just trying to make money. They were trying to hurt me and the people around me. It felt like someone was deliberately trying to destroy my relationships, my reputation, and my sense of security. I finally decided to go to the police. I didn't think they'd be able to do much, but I needed to report it. They took down the details, and while they were sympathetic, they basically told me that there wasn't much they could do about an online account being hacked. It was a frustrating experience, knowing that there was a real person out there behind all of this, but having no way of finding out who they were or stopping them. At this point, I had given up hope of ever getting my account back. I just wanted the harassment to stop. I contacted Facebook again, this time with more urgency, explaining that my account wasn't just hacked, it was being used to threaten people. I finally got a response from a real person, and they told me they would investigate the situation. It took another couple of days, but eventually they disabled the account entirely. It was a relief, but it also felt like a loss. That account had been a part of my life for over a decade, and now it was gone. The immediate threat was over, but the damage was done. I had to deal with the fallout for weeks afterward. Some of my friends never really got over what happened. They couldn't separate me from the scammer who had taken over my account. They didn't trust me anymore, even though I had nothing to do with it. My family was shaken by the threats they had received, and it took a long time for things to feel normal again. I ended up deleting most of my social media accounts after that. I couldn't bring myself to trust them anymore. Even now, months later, I'm still paranoid about online security. I've locked down everything I possibly can. Two-factor authentication, complex passwords, everything. But that sense of vulnerability never really goes away. I learned the hard way that we're all just one hack away from losing control of our digital lives, and once it happens, it's almost impossible to put the pieces back together. It's scary to think about how much power we give to these platforms, how much of our lives are tied up in them. When you lose control of your account, it's not just about losing access to a website, it's about losing control of your identity. And in the wrong hands, that can be devastating. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone. I used to love looking through my Facebook memories. It's one of those small things that makes you realize how much your life has changed over the years, how you've grown, and how much you've been through. Every day, I'd get a little notification showing me what I posted a year, 5 years, or even 10 years ago. Most of it was harmless. Photos of old friends, trips I'd taken, random thoughts or jokes I'd shared. It was always kind of comforting, like flipping through an old photo album but without the dust. I didn't think twice about sharing those memories again sometimes. It felt like a way to relive the past for a brief moment, to show how far I've come or to remember a different time in my life. It felt like such a harmless thing to do, just a small way of staying connected with myself and with people from my past. But I never really considered who might be paying attention to all of that. I never thought about who might be lurking in the background, reading every little thing I posted. I guess I always assumed that the people who were seeing my posts were the same people I was friends with, people who knew me. I never thought there could be someone out there who was quietly piecing together my life, detail by detail, waiting for the right moment to turn it all against me. It started innocently enough, as these things usually do. I posted an old memory of a road trip I had taken with some friends back in college. The photo was nothing special, just a picture of us standing next to the car, smiling and covered in dust after a day of hiking. It was one of those carefree moments that felt nice to look back on. I shared it with a little caption about how much fun we had that day, and a few of my old friends commented, reminiscing about the trip. A few days after that, I got a message from someone I didn't recognize. His name was Michael, and his profile picture was one of those generic-looking images, just him in sunglasses standing in front of some building. I didn't remember ever meeting him, but he mentioned that he had seen the photo I posted, and that it reminded him of a trip he had taken to the same place around the same time. He asked if I remembered him from back then, saying we might have crossed paths. At first I thought maybe he was someone I had met briefly during that trip and just didn't remember. I've met a lot of people over the years, and it's not uncommon for someone to pop up and claim we've met before, even if I can't quite place them. So I responded politely, saying I wasn't sure, but that it was possible we had run into each other. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wish I had just ignored him. Over the next few days, Michael started messaging me more frequently. He was friendly enough, asking about other trips I had taken or mentioning places we both had in common. At first I didn't see any harm in it. It felt like just another random person reconnecting over shared experiences. But then he started asking more specific questions. Questions that made me feel uneasy. He'd ask about places I used to live, jobs I'd had, and people I knew from those times. He'd bring up small details that I had posted years ago, things I had almost forgotten about myself. He'd reference old relationships, friendships that had ended, and even little things like where I used to go for coffee when I lived in a certain city. It was unsettling, but I figured he had just been following my posts for a while and remembered more than most people would. Then it got worse. One day I posted another memory. This time of an ex-boyfriend I had dated years ago when I was living in Chicago. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a casual post about an old date we had gone on, accompanied by a photo of us at a restaurant. The relationship had ended a long time ago, and I hadn't spoken to him in years. But it was a good memory at the time, so I didn't see any harm in sharing it. Michael messaged me again that night, but this time, his tone was different. He didn't ask me about the photo or comment on the memory. Instead, he sent me a screenshot of an old post I had made years ago, one that I had forgotten even existed. It was a post I had made during the breakup with that same ex-boyfriend. In the post, I had vented about how hurt I was, how betrayed I felt by him, and how much I hated the way things had ended. It was raw and emotional, something I never intended to revisit, and seeing it again made my stomach churn. I hadn't shared that post in years. It wasn't even one of my Facebook memories. The fact that Michael had found it meant that he had been digging through my old posts, scrolling back through years of my life to find this one moment of vulnerability. It felt invasive, like someone had rifled through my diary without permission. I asked him why he had sent me that, and his response was vague, something about how it stood out to him. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. But deep down, I felt a growing sense of unease. Over the next few weeks, I became more cautious about what I posted. I stopped sharing my Facebook memories, stopped posting about my past, and even started going through my old posts, deleting anything that felt too personal. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. One night, I was sitting at home when I got another message from Michael. This time, it wasn't just a screenshot of an old post. It was a photo, one I hadn't seen in years. It was a picture of the house I grew up in, the same house I had posted about months earlier. But this photo wasn't from my childhood. It was recent. The house looked older, the paint a little more faded, the yard a little more overgrown. It was clear that someone had taken this photo recently, like within the last few weeks. My heart raced as I stared at the photo. I hadn't been back to that house in years. My family had sold it a long time ago, and I had no reason to go back. How did Michael have this photo? How did he know where I grew up? I hadn't posted the address or even mentioned the specific town in any of my posts. I had been careful about that, so how did he know? I messaged him, asking him where he had gotten the photo. His response was chilling. He told me that he had visited the area recently and thought I might like to see how the old place looked. He mentioned specific details about the house, things that weren't in the photo, like the color of the front door, the garden in the backyard, and even the tree I used to climb as a kid. There was no way he could have known those things unless he had been there. I didn't respond to his message. Instead, I blocked him immediately and went through my entire friends list, trying to figure out if there was anyone else who seemed suspicious. I deleted anyone I didn't recognize, locked down my privacy settings, and even considered deleting my account altogether. But that feeling of safety I used to have on social media was gone. No matter what I did, it felt like he could still see me, still find ways to track my life. The next few days were tense. I was constantly checking over my shoulder, always feeling like someone was watching me, waiting for something else to happen. I couldn't focus at work, and I barely slept. I kept wondering if he had followed me in real life, if he knew where I lived now, if he was going to show up at my door. Then, one night, I got another message. This time it was from a different account, a new profile with no photo, no information, just a blank slate. The message was simple: "I'll always know where you are." There was no name attached, but I knew it was him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had created a new account just to continue messaging me, just to keep reminding me that no matter what I did, I couldn't escape him. I reported the account to Facebook, but nothing happened. The messages kept coming, always from new accounts, always vague and threatening. He never directly said he was going to hurt me, but the implication was always there. He wanted me to know that he could find me, that he knew my past, my present, and possibly even my future. I stopped using Facebook altogether after that. I deleted my account, wiped my old posts, and cut myself off from social media as much as possible. I moved to a different apartment, changed my phone number, and started using a different email address for everything. But even with all of those precautions, I couldn't shake the fear that he was still out there, still watching, still waiting. It's been months since I last heard from him, but the fear hasn't gone away. Every time I see a new friend request or get an unexpected email, my heart skips a beat. I can't help but wonder if it's him, if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to remind me that he's always watching. A couple of years ago, I was in a bit of a rough patch. I had been working as a graphic designer in Atlanta for a small firm, but after a round of layoffs, I found myself without a job. It wasn't completely unexpected, but it still hit me hard. I spent the next few months frantically applying to any job I could find, trying to stay afloat while my savings slowly dwindled away. During this time, I became more reliant on social media to network and look for job opportunities. I had always used LinkedIn and some freelance job boards, but I found myself scrolling through Facebook more often, joining groups for creatives and networking with people in my field. I even started posting about my job search, hoping that someone might see it and point me toward an opportunity. One day, out of the blue, I got a message on Facebook from a guy named James. His profile seemed normal enough. Pictures of him at work events, a few posts about his hobbies, and mutual connections with some people I knew from the design community in Atlanta. He introduced himself as a recruiter for a marketing company in Chicago and said he had seen my portfolio online. He told me his company was expanding and looking for designers to work remotely on a freelance basis, with the possibility of going full-time in the future. It sounded promising. The way he presented the opportunity made it seem legitimate. He even attached some details about the company and the types of projects they were working on. I did a quick Google search, and sure enough, there was a real company by that name with an office in Chicago. It seemed like a great opportunity, and at that point I was desperate for work, so I was excited. We exchanged messages over the next couple of days, and everything seemed to check out. He told me that the company had reviewed my portfolio and wanted to move forward with the hiring process. They were ready to offer me a freelance contract with competitive pay, and all I needed to do was provide some basic information so they could set me up in their system. He sent over a standard-looking application form that asked for my name, address, phone number, and email. Nothing out of the ordinary. I filled it out and sent it back, thinking that was the end of it. But a few hours later, James messaged me again, saying the company also needed my social security number for tax purposes, as well as my bank account information for direct deposit. This was the first red flag that gave me pause. I had done freelance work before, and it wasn't unusual to provide that information for tax reasons, but something about the way he asked for it felt off. Still, I was in a tough spot financially. I had been out of work for months, and the idea of finally landing a paying gig, especially with a company that could potentially offer a full-time position, was too tempting to ignore. I hesitated for a bit, but eventually decided to send the information. I told myself it was just part of the process, and that this was a legitimate opportunity. That was my first big mistake. After I sent the information, I didn't hear from James for a couple of days. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe things were just moving slowly on their end. Or maybe they were finalizing the contract. But after about a week of silence, I started getting anxious. I tried messaging him again, asking for an update on the project and when I could expect to start, but I didn't get a response. Then one morning, I woke up to find my bank account had been completely drained. Every penny I had left was gone. I remember staring at my banking app in disbelief, trying to make sense of what had happened. There were multiple unauthorized transactions, all made within the span of a few hours. I immediately called my bank and reported the fraud, but the damage was already done. My account was wiped out, and it would take weeks before any of the charges could be reversed, if they could be reversed at all. Panic set in. I tried messaging James again, but his profile had disappeared. Not just blocked me, completely gone, as if it had never existed. I searched for the company he claimed to work for and called their office in Chicago. But when I asked about James, they told me they had no idea who he was. No one by that name worked there, and they weren't hiring for any remote positions. I felt sick. It hit me all at once that I had been scammed. I had handed over my personal information, my social security number, my bank account details, to some stranger on Facebook. And now I was paying the price. I had been so desperate for a job, so eager to believe that this was a real opportunity, that I had ignored the warning signs. And now, my financial situation had gone from bad to worse. I reported the scam to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They took down my information and filed a report, but they told me that online scams like this were hard to trace. The scammer had probably used a fake name and a burner phone, and his Facebook profile had been deleted before they could even begin to investigate. They advised me to contact the credit bureaus to freeze my credit and to keep an eye on my accounts for any signs of identity theft. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I was constantly on edge, checking my bank accounts and credit reports every day, terrified that more damage would be done. I had to deal with the fallout of having my social security number stolen, calls with credit agencies, trying to protect myself from further identity theft, and dealing with the bank to recover what little money I could. But it didn't end there. A few weeks after the scam, I started getting phone calls from unfamiliar numbers. At first, I thought they were just telemarketers, but when I answered, the voice on the other end was always the same. Calm, almost casual. The man never said much. He'd just ask me how I was doing, say something vague about work, and then hang up before I could respond. It was eerie. I couldn't tell if it was James or someone else, but the calls kept coming, always from different numbers. It was like he was letting me know that he hadn't forgotten about me, that he still had my information and could reach me whenever he wanted. I blocked the numbers, but new ones kept popping up. Sometimes I'd get voicemails with nothing but silence. Other times, the man would leave short, cryptic messages like, "Hope things are looking up for you," or "Take care of yourself out there." They weren't direct threats, but they were unsettling. It felt like he was playing with me, reminding me that he still had control. I became paranoid. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers altogether and changed my phone number, hoping that would stop the harassment. But even after changing my number, I still felt vulnerable. I knew that whoever this was had my social security number, my bank details, and enough personal information to potentially ruin my life. The thought of that kind of power in the hands of someone who had already scammed me made it hard to sleep at night. The financial toll was bad enough, but the psychological impact was worse. I became hyper-vigilant about everything I did online. I stopped using social media altogether, afraid that I might fall for another scam, or that someone else might be watching me. I triple-checked every email, every message, every call, constantly second-guessing myself, wondering if it was real or another attempt to exploit me. I spent months trying to clean up the mess. I had to take on a second job just to make ends meet after my savings were wiped out, and I was constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't know if the scammer would come after me again, or if my personal information would be sold to someone else who would use it to open accounts in my name or take out loans. It felt like a time bomb was ticking, and I had no idea when or if it would go off. I still don't know who James really was or how he found me in the first place. Maybe he had seen my posts about looking for work and figured I was an easy target. Maybe he had been following me for a while, waiting for the right moment to strike. I'll probably never know. Last year, I went through a pretty bad breakup. We had been together for almost 3 years, and when it ended, I found myself feeling really lonely. I spent a lot of time by myself, just going through the motions of life, trying to get past it. To cope with that loneliness, I started getting more active on social media. I'd scroll through Facebook a lot, looking at old pictures, posts from the past, and reconnecting with people I hadn't talked to in a long time. It was comforting in a way. Reaching out to old friends reminded me that I wasn't completely alone, even though it felt that way. One day, I got a friend request from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Sarah, a girl I went to high school with back in Chicago. We weren't super close back then, but we had some mutual friends and hung out at a few parties. She had always been nice enough, but after high school, we drifted apart. So when I saw her friend request pop up, I was surprised, but not too suspicious. I figured she was just reaching out, like a lot of people do, reconnecting with old acquaintances. I accepted the request, and a few days later, she sent me a message. At first, it was just small talk, catching up on life, reminiscing about high school, talking about how much things had changed since then. She told me she had recently moved to Boston for work, which was a coincidence because that's where I lived now, too. We chatted off and on for the next few weeks, and it was nice. It felt good to have someone to talk to, especially since I was still feeling pretty raw from the breakup. As we kept talking, the conversations got more personal. Sarah started opening up about her own struggles, how she had been through a tough breakup too, how moving to a new city had been hard for her, and how she didn't have many friends in Boston yet. I could relate to a lot of what she was saying, so I found myself being more open with her than I normally would be with someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It felt like we were both in the same boat, both trying to figure out life in this new city, both looking for some kind of connection. Eventually, we started talking almost every day. It became a routine, waking up to messages from her, chatting during my lunch break, and talking late into the night. She'd tell me about her job, her hobbies, the places she liked to visit around the city. I told her about my work, my apartment, the restaurants I liked to eat at. The conversations were always light, sometimes flirty, and after a while, I started to feel something more for her. It was weird because we hadn't seen each other in years, and we hadn't even met up in person yet. But the way we talked made it feel like we were becoming more than just old friends reconnecting. One night, after a few weeks of this, she asked me if I wanted to meet up. She suggested we grab coffee or go for a walk around the city, something casual. I was excited about the idea. It felt like the natural next step, finally putting a face to the person I had been talking to so much. I agreed, and we made plans to meet at a coffee shop near Copley Square the following weekend. The day of the meetup came, and I was nervous but excited. I got to the coffee shop a little early and found a table by the window. I texted her to let her know I was there, and she responded saying she was running a few minutes late. I waited, sipping on my coffee, watching people walk by outside. 30 minutes passed, then 45. I texted her again, asking if she was still coming, but she didn't respond. After an hour of waiting, I figured something must have come up, so I left. I wasn't upset, just a little disappointed. I assumed she had gotten caught up with something, or maybe she had changed her mind about meeting up. Later that evening, I got a message from her apologizing profusely. She told me she had been caught in a work emergency and hadn't been able to make it. She seemed genuinely sorry, and since I wasn't the type to hold grudges over something like that, I told her it was no big deal. We made plans to meet up again the following weekend, and I let it go. But the same thing happened again. This time, we were supposed to meet for dinner, and once again, she didn't show up. I waited for over an hour, texting her multiple times, but I didn't get a response until hours later. She apologized again, saying something had come up at the last minute, and she hadn't been able to let me know. I started to feel a little suspicious, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just really busy with work, or maybe she was nervous about meeting in person. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. We kept talking after that, but every time we made plans to meet up, she'd flake at the last minute. Sometimes she'd have a believable excuse, work, family issues, whatever. Other times she'd just go silent and then apologize after the fact. It became a pattern, and after a while, I started to feel frustrated. I liked talking to her, but the constant cancellations were starting to get to me. I decided to confront her about it one night, asking why she kept canceling. I told her that if she wasn't interested in meeting up, that was fine, but I didn't want to keep getting my hopes up only to be let down. Her response was strange. She got defensive, saying that she had been going through a lot lately, and that I needed to be more understanding. She accused me of not caring about what she was dealing with, and made me feel guilty for even bringing it up. At that point, I started to feel like something wasn't right. The way she reacted didn't make sense, and I began to wonder if there was more to this than I realized. But I didn't want to lose the connection we had built, so I backed off and tried to be supportive. I told myself that maybe she was just going through a rough time, and that I needed to be patient. Then things started to get even weirder. One night, while we were chatting, she mentioned something about my neighborhood, something oddly specific. She talked about a little bakery down the street from my apartment, a place I hadn't mentioned to her before. When I asked her how she knew about it, she said she had walked by it one day while exploring the area. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but then she started bringing up more details about where I lived. She knew the name of the park near my building, the coffee shop I frequented, even the layout of my street. I hadn't told her any of this. I asked her how she knew so much about my neighborhood, and she just brushed it off, saying she had been in the area a few times and had a good memory. But it didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I started to wonder if she had been watching me, following me around without me knowing. It seemed far-fetched, but the details she knew were too specific to be a coincidence. A few days later, I decided to do some digging. I went through her Facebook profile again, looking for any signs that something was off. That's when I noticed something strange. Her profile, which had seemed so real and full of activity, suddenly looked empty. A lot of her old posts were gone, and some of the photos I had seen before had disappeared. Her profile had been wiped clean, almost as if she had deleted everything except for the bare minimum. I tried messaging her to ask about it, but she didn't respond. Her account was still there, but she wasn't replying to any of my messages. I started to get anxious, feeling like I had been duped somehow. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like this whole thing had been a lie, like Sarah wasn't who she said she was. I decided to reach out to one of our mutual friends from high school, someone who had known her back then. I asked if they had talked to Sarah recently, and to my surprise, they told me that they hadn't spoken to her in years. They mentioned that Sarah had moved to a different city a while back and wasn't even on Facebook anymore. I was floored. If the real Sarah wasn't in Boston and wasn't on Facebook, then who had I been talking to all this time? Panic set in as I realized that I had been catfished. Someone had created a fake profile using Sarah's name and photos, pretending to be her to get close to me. I had no idea who this person really was or what their intentions were, but it was clear that they had been manipulating me from the start. I felt sick to my stomach. All those conversations, all those plans to meet up, it had all been a lie. But what scared me the most was the thought that this person knew so much about my life. They knew where I lived, where I liked to hang out, even the people I was close to. I had let them into my life without even realizing it, and now I had no idea what they were capable of. I blocked the fake Sarah's account and reported it to Facebook, but that didn't make me feel any safer. For weeks, I was constantly on edge, wondering if this person was still watching me, still following me around without my knowledge. Every time I saw someone lingering near my apartment or felt like I was being watched, I couldn't shake the fear that it was them. I stopped using Facebook after that, and I've been much more cautious about who I let into my life since then. But even now, I still think about it, about how easily someone was able to manipulate me, about how much information I unknowingly gave away. It's terrifying to realize how vulnerable we are online, how quickly our lives can be invaded by someone we don't even know. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again.